The torch hit the barn door before anyone said a word. Elder Harmon Crest didn't shout, didn't warn. He simply nodded to the two men beside him, and they pressed the flame against the frozen wood like it was nothing, like there wasn't a woman shivering inside. Liora Ashcroft heard the crackling before she smelled the smoke. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and felt the heat traveling through the timber. She was 31 years old. She had delivered 47 babies in this settlement. She had sat beside dying men and held their hands when their wives couldn't bear to. And now the people she saved were burning her alive, because she had a birthmark on her wrist, and 3 children died of fever during the worst winter in 20 years. Ask yourself something. What would you do if the people you spent your life saving decided you deserved to die? Because that question is exactly where this story begins. If this kind of story moves you, stories about real courage, real survival, and the kind of human strength that doesn't get talked about enough, please subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night everything changed for Liora Ashcroft. The settlement of Dunmore's Crossing did not become cruel overnight. That was the thing people never wanted to admit afterward, that cruelty rarely announces itself. It doesn't walk through the front door with its hands raised and its intentions plain. It creeps in through the cracks, the way cold air does, finding the weak spots in walls that looked solid from the outside. It starts with a whisper, then a rumor, then someone repeating that rumor at the wrong moment to the wrong kind of frightened people, and by the time anyone notices what's happening, the damage is already bone deep. Dunmore's Crossing had been struggling before the sickness came. 3 seasons of thin harvest. A trading route that dried up when the eastern mountain pass flooded and stayed flooded. Men who came home from work with less coin than they needed and more frustration than they could manage. Women stretching what little they had so far. It felt like they were living on hope alone. And not the warm kind, the desperate kind, the kind that makes your stomach hurt. So when the fever arrived in November, slipping into the settlement like a cold hand pressing itself against every door at once, the community didn't respond the way it should have. It responded the way starving, exhausted, frightened people always do. It looked for someone to blame. Liora had been the settlement's healer for 6 years. She hadn't chosen the role so much as it had chosen her. Her mother had taught her the work, and her mother's mother before that. And when Liora arrived in Dunmore's Crossing with her husband Thomas at 25 years old, the settlement had been without a healer for nearly 2 years. The nearest doctor was 4 days' ride to the south. People were dying of things that didn't need to be fatal, and Liora had the knowledge and the hands to do something about it. So she did. She didn't charge what she couldn't get. When a family had nothing, she worked for nothing. When she sat with Mrs. Hale during a birth that lasted 18 hours and went sideways 3 separate times, she didn't leave. Not to eat, not to sleep, not even when Thomas came to the door and asked her please to come home before midnight. She stayed, and Mrs. Hale survived, and so did the baby. What Liora was not was perfect. She had a temper that surprised people who expected healers to be endlessly patient. She could be blunt to the point of rudeness when someone was wasting her time or risking their child's life with foolishness. She made mistakes. She admitted them, which was more than most people did, but it didn't make the mistakes disappear. The Hartley boy's arm, set badly during a fall 2 winters back, had healed crooked. She'd done her best with what she had, but best wasn't always enough, and she knew it. And she had the birthmark. It was on her left wrist, about 2 inches below the base of her hand. A deep reddish-purple mark roughly the shape of a spread hand, irregular at the edges. She'd had it since birth. It didn't hurt. It didn't mean anything. But it was visible when she worked, when she pushed her sleeves up during difficult procedures, and in a settlement already stretched thin with worry, it gave people something to look at when they needed a reason that wasn't really a reason. She first noticed the shift in October, just before the fever arrived. Old Marin Schultz stopped her outside the mill and told her that her granddaughter had dreamed about that mark, and that in the dream it had moved, had crawled up Leora's arm like something alive. Liora had said, as kindly as she could manage, that birthmarks do not crawl. Marin Schultz had not looked satisfied with that answer. She had looked like a woman storing information for later. Then the children started getting sick. The fever moved fast. That was the part that scared people most, not just the severity, though that was real, but the speed. A child would be well at breakfast and burning at supper. The symptoms were brutal: high fever, severe cramps, a strange bluish tinge at the fingertips and lips that Liora had never seen before and could not explain. She tried everything she knew: willow bark tea for the fever, compressed treatments for the cramping. She stayed up 3 nights in a row, moving between households, doing what she could. 2 children died the first week. Liora stood in the snow outside the second family's house and allowed herself 30 seconds to fall apart, and then she put herself back together and went to the next child who needed her. That was how she'd been trained. Grief later. Work now. The third child, Ruth Crest, 7 years old, granddaughter of Elder Harmon Crest, died on a Tuesday morning in late November while Liora was treating her. She was there when it happened. She had her hand on the child's forehead and felt the moment the fever stopped being a fight and became something else. She told Elder Crest herself. She sat down in his front room, still in her coat with snow melting off the shoulders, and she told him. She said she was sorry. She said she had done everything she knew to do. She said it wasn't enough, and she was sorry. Harmon Crest looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. Then he said, "Leave my house." She left. She should have understood then what was coming. Maybe part of her did. But she had other patients, other families, other children burning with fever, and she couldn't let herself stop to think about what that look on Harmon Crest's face had really meant. She told Thomas that night that Crest was in grief, that grieving people say things and don't say things, and that she wasn't going to take it personally. Thomas had looked at her across the table with the expression he wore when he thought she was being naive but didn't want to start a fight about it, and said that he hoped she was right. He wasn't the type of man who enjoyed being right about bad things. What happened over the next 2 weeks was not dramatic in a single moment. It was 100 small moments, each one barely worth mentioning on its own, and then all at once they had built into something enormous and impossible to stop. A cluster of women who stopped speaking when Liora passed. The butcher who suddenly had no meat to spare when she came by for the broth she needed for a sick patient. Children told to stay inside when she came to a door. Someone's husband blocking the threshold and saying his wife was resting, and they would send for Liora if they needed her. They would not send for her. She heard what was being said. She would have had to be deaf and blind not to. The birthmark. The mark of ill intent. The mark that moved in Maren Schultz's granddaughter's dream. The healer who was always present when the children died, as if Liora's presence was evidence against her, rather than the simple reality of being the only person in the settlement trained to fight death at close range. Harmon Crest was the one who made it formal. He called the meeting on the 1st of December. Liora and Thomas weren't told about it beforehand. They found out it had happened when their nearest neighbor, a man named Pollard, who owed Liora his wife's life and still couldn't quite look her in the eye, knocked on their door at dusk and told them in a voice that shook with something between guilt and relief that the settlement had made a decision. "What kind of decision?" Thomas asked. Pollard wouldn't come inside. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and wouldn't look at either of them. And he said that the consensus was that Liora's presence in Dunmore's Crossing was putting the settlement at risk, and that it had been decided she would need to leave before the week was out. Thomas's jaw went tight. Liora put her hand on his arm. "Who decided this?" Thomas said. His voice was very quiet, which meant he was angrier than he was letting show. "The elders. Elder Crest. Harmon Crest lost a granddaughter he loved," Thomas said. "He's a man in grief. He doesn't speak for this community." "He's speaking for it now," Pollard said, and then he looked at Liora for just a moment, one quick, pained look, and said, "I'm sorry," and he left. They had 4 days. Liora spent 2 of them trying to finish what she'd started, still moving between sick households, still doing the work, even as the reception got colder. The 3rd day, a group of men came to the door in the late afternoon. Not threatening, exactly, just present, standing in a half circle in the snow outside the front of the house, not speaking, just making a point. Thomas looked at them through the window for a long time before he turned around. "We need to go," he said. "It's the middle of winter," Liora said. "There's 3 feet of snow in the pass." "I know." "Thomas." "Liora." He said her name the way he did when she needed to stop arguing and listen. Those aren't men standing out there having a conversation. Those are men deciding how much longer to be patient. He looked at her. "We need to go tonight." She wanted to tell him he was wrong. She wanted it badly enough that she almost convinced herself. But she'd seen Harmon Crest's face when she told him his granddaughter was dead. She'd seen the way Pollard couldn't look at her. She'd heard the rumors and watched the doors close, one by one, like dominoes falling slowly over the course of weeks. She packed what she could carry. Thomas did the same. They left after dark. The cold was the kind that has weight to it, that presses down from above and pushes in from every side at once. The kind of cold that doesn't feel natural but feels deliberate, like the winter itself has an opinion about what's happening. Leora's breath was a cloud in front of her face within seconds of stepping outside. She'd layered everything she had: 2 coats, her heaviest wool stockings, gloves, a scarf wrapped twice around her neck and up over her mouth. And it still wasn't enough. She knew within the first 20 minutes it wasn't enough. Thomas carried the pack with their food. She carried the satchel with her medicines and her mother's journal, the one with the remedies, the one she'd have carried out of a burning house before she carried almost anything else. They moved north because that was the direction away from the worst of it, away from the southern pass, away from the trade road where they might be too easily followed. Thomas knew of a settlement 2 days north, maybe 3 in this weather, a smaller place called Harwick, where they'd traded once and been treated decently. That was the plan. North to Harwick, figure out the rest from there. They walked for 4 hours before Liora admitted her feet were wrong. She'd felt the numbness starting around the 2nd hour, but told herself it was manageable. It would pass. Bodies acclimatize. By the 3rd hour, it was past her ankles. By the 4th, she couldn't feel her toes clearly enough to say with certainty they were all there. Thomas noticed before she said anything. He stopped, grabbed her arm, made her stop walking, and dropped to one knee in the snow to pull her boot off in the dark and cold and wind, and she heard him make a sound that wasn't quite a word, a low, involuntary sound that came from somewhere below speech. "How long?" he asked. 2 hours, maybe? I don't know. Liora. I know. He put her boot back on and stood up and didn't lecture her because there was nothing to say that would help. And they kept walking because stopping was worse than walking. But the pace was slower now, and they both knew it, and neither of them said what they were thinking about what slower pace meant in this temperature over this distance. Thomas started coughing around midnight. Not a new cough. He'd had something irritating his chest since October, one of those stubborn seasonal things that wouldn't quite commit to being an illness but wouldn't quite go away either. Liora had given him things for it. They'd seemed to help, but he'd packed the medicines for others, not for himself. And the cold hit the cough like a hammer hitting a nail, and by 2 in the morning he was stopping every 100 yards to bend forward and get through the spasm. "Give me the pack," Liora said. "I've got it." "Thomas, give me the pack." "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You are coughing so hard you're stopping, and we cannot afford to stop. Give me the pack." He gave her the pack. She shouldn't have been able to carry both the pack and the satchel and keep walking. She did it anyway because the alternative was leaving something behind or watching Thomas carry weight he couldn't manage, and neither of those things was acceptable. Dawn came gray and thin and reluctant, like it had decided to show up but wasn't putting in real effort. The wind had picked up overnight and was working against them now, blowing directly into their faces when they faced north, cold enough to make her eyes water, and the tears freeze on her cheeks before they'd traveled an inch. They found the barn by accident. They'd gone off the track sometime in the dark. She was almost sure now, looking at the landscape in the pale morning light, that they'd drifted east. And the barn appeared out of the white like something dreamed rather than built, a dark shape against the blown snow blank of the field. Thomas went for it without a word. She followed. The door was frozen in its track and took both of them pulling together to open it enough to slide through. Inside it was barely warmer than outside, maybe 10 degrees of difference, which didn't sound like much but felt like a fire after what they'd been walking through. There were old feed troughs along one wall, a pile of rotted hay in the corner that still had enough material to theoretically retain heat. Part of the roof was down at the far end, open to the sky. Thomas sat down against the wall the moment they were inside and didn't get back up. She saw it in his face before she heard it in his breathing. She dropped both bags and got to him and pressed her fingers to his neck to feel the pulse, too fast, too shallow. And she helped him lean forward, and she felt his chest and back, and she knew. She'd known for an hour but made herself not know, because knowing wasn't something she could afford on that road in the dark. "It's bad," he said. He said it flat, without drama, the way he said most things. "It's manageable," she said. Liora. She opened the medicine satchel and started looking for what she needed, going through it by touch in the gray light because it was faster. He watched her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to argue with her and choosing not to. The expression that meant he was letting her take care of him, even though every instinct he had resisted being taken care of. "You're going to be fine," she said, and she believed it, or she made herself believe it because she had to. She believed it through that morning and into the afternoon. She worked on him without stopping, giving him what she had, keeping him warm with everything they owned, telling him what she was doing and why, keeping her voice level and certain the way her mother had taught her. "The patient hears the healer's voice more than the words," her mother had said. "They take their cue from how you sound. Sound certain, and they'll hold on a little longer." She sounded certain for 8 more hours. Thomas died at dusk. She did not notice it happen. That was what she could never quite put into words afterward. In the time when she tried to tell the story, she hadn't noticed the exact moment. She'd had his hand in hers, and she'd been talking to him, and she'd looked at the light changing through the gap in the roof, and when she looked back, his chest wasn't moving. She held his hand for a long time after that. The cold did not stop for grief. The temperature dropped through the night, and at some point Liora registered distantly that the barn wall behind her was developing ice on the interior surface, and that meant the structure was failing, and that meant the thin shelter she had was going away. She registered this without caring very much. She was aware, in the detached way of someone watching themselves from outside their own body, that she was probably going to die, that her feet were numb past the ankle on both sides, that she hadn't eaten in almost a full day, that her hands, when she looked at them, had started to take on that waxy, glassy quality that she recognized. She recognized it from patients, from people she'd worked on who were in the early stages of cold injury, and she felt a strange and exhausted flicker of dark humor that she was diagnosing herself the same way she'd diagnosed them. She leaned her head back against the wall. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the settlement, about Mrs. Hale's baby, about the Hartley boy's crooked arm, about the faces of the children she hadn't been able to save. She thought about her mother's journal, which was still in the satchel next to her, full of knowledge that was going to die in this barn. She didn't pray. She just got quiet, which was its own kind of surrender. And then the barn door ground open. Not the way wind opens a door, not with a bang or a gust. It opened the way a person opens a door when they're being deliberate about it, when they know there might be something inside that could startle. The light that came in was the thin bluish light of deep winter dusk, and against it was a shape, large, not shaped like a thread exactly, but large enough that any other moment she might have moved, might have reacted. She didn't move. The shape stepped inside and was a man. Very tall, with a heavy coat that looked like it had been worn for years rather than bought, and a face that was weathered in the particular way of men who lived without shelter's regularity, the kind of tan and crease that doesn't come from intention but from exposure. He had a beard that covered most of his face. He was carrying an axe, not raised, just carried, the way a man carries a tool rather than a weapon. He looked at her. He looked at Thomas. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply leave. Then he said, in a voice rough at the edges like wood that needed planing, "You're still alive." She looked at him. She didn't answer because it seemed obvious and she didn't have the energy for the obvious. "Barely," he said, answering himself, and he crouched down to her level, setting the axe to one side, and looked at her with the focused, assessing look of someone who was actually examining her rather than reacting to her. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He reached out, without asking. She tensed, but didn't pull back, and pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, not the marked wrist, but the other one, taking her pulse the way she'd done for Thomas. Then he looked at her face again and said, "Can you walk?" "I don't know," she said. Her voice was not what it had been. It was smaller, more careful with its movements. "I need you to try," he said, "because if you stay in here another 2 hours, I can't help you." She looked at Thomas. The man followed her gaze. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not with any particular performance of feeling, but something shifted behind his eyes. "He's yours?" the man asked. "My husband," she said. The man was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." She had the strangest impulse to say thank you, and something about that impulse, the normalcy of it, the ridiculous social reflex of it in this barn in the middle of dying, broke something loose in her chest that had been held tight for a long time. Not tears. Something else. Something like air being let out slowly after being held too long. "Where would you take me?" she asked. "My cabin," he said. "About a mile east. Maybe a little more." "Who are you?" "Gideon Thornridge," he said. "I live out here." He said it without any particular apology for what that might mean, without the self-consciousness she might have expected from a man explaining that he lived alone in the wilderness. He just said it. "I saw your tracks in the field this morning and figured someone was in trouble. Took me a while to backtrack you." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her without flinching, without pressing her. He had the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing frightened things made them worse. She thought about the people who'd stood in a half circle outside her door saying nothing. She thought about Pollard's quick, pained look. She thought about the torch against the barn door. "All right," she said. He helped her up. She couldn't put full weight on her feet, and he noticed, without making a thing of it, just shifted his grip and let her lean in a way that made the weight manageable. She looked back at Thomas once before they went through the door. She said something to him in her mind that she'd never been able to say properly out loud. Then she went through the door and into the wind. Gideon Thornridge walked at her pace the whole way. When she slowed, he slowed. When she stumbled, his arm steadied her without her having to ask. He didn't talk, which she appreciated. She was not in a place for talking. The mile and a little more felt like 10. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, dark logs, low roof, smoke from the chimney, a thin straight line rising in the windless pocket of the trees that surrounded it. She was leaning on him more than walking beside him. She wasn't embarrassed about it. She was too tired for embarrassment. He got the door open and the warmth hit her face like something solid, and her body made a sound she hadn't told it to make. A low, involuntary intake of breath, almost pained, the kind of reaction that happens below intention. The fireplace was going. There was a lamp. There was a table with a chair pushed back like he'd left in a hurry. A rough wooden shelf along one wall with stacked jars and a few tools. He sat her down near the fire and started pulling her boots off, and she let him. And when he saw the state of her feet, he didn't say anything. He just went to get what he needed, methodical and quiet. And she sat there in the warmth of a stranger's fire and felt the first fragile stirring of something she hadn't felt for a long time. Not safety. Not yet. Not quite. But the possibility of it. The warmth didn't come all at once. That was what Liora would remember later. Not some sudden flood of comfort, not the relief she'd read about in stories where the hero finds shelter, and everything goes soft and golden. It came in degrees, the way thawing always does, and some of those degrees hurt worse than the cold had. Her feet, as sensation began returning to them, moved through numbness into something that felt like fire being pressed directly against the skin. Not warmth, not at first, but pain that meant the tissue was still alive and fighting to stay that way. She pressed her lips together and made no sound, because making sound required energy she didn't have, and also because there was a stranger crouched at her feet, doing careful work, and she didn't want to startle him. Gideon Thornridge had said very little since he'd brought her inside. That suited her. He moved around the cabin with the economy of a man who'd been alone long enough that he'd stopped narrating his own actions. No explaining what he was doing or why, no reassuring comments, just the movement itself. He'd wrapped her feet in cloth that had been warmed near the fire. He'd put a tin cup of something into her hands. Broth, thin but hot, made from what looked like dried herbs and some kind of bone he'd had simmering in the pot at the back of the stove. He'd placed a second log on the fire without asking whether she wanted him to, which she appreciated because she'd have said no out of some ridiculous reflex toward not being a burden, and she needed the heat badly. She drank the broth in small sips because her stomach was contracted with cold and hunger, and she knew better than to rush it, and she watched him from across the firelight and tried to take his measure. He was older than she'd first thought, somewhere in his late 40s, maybe 50. It was hard to say with men who lived hard outdoor lives because the elements aged the surface while sometimes leaving the substance intact. The lines in his face were deep and organized in the way of wind rather than worry, though she suspected there'd been worry too. He had the kind of hands that told stories, knuckle-thick, scarred along the back, the left index finger bent at an angle that suggested it had been broken and hadn't been set by anyone who knew what they were doing. He wore his beard the way men wear things they stopped thinking about long ago, neither tended nor neglected. What she noticed most, sitting in the firelight trying to stay present and not slide into the grief that was waiting for her just below the surface of conscious thought, was that he never looked at her wrist. Not once. Every person in Dunmore's Crossing, from the moment they'd heard the rumors, had done it. That small, involuntary flicker of the eyes, down to the left wrist, checking, confirming. Even the ones who were kind about it. Even Pollard, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, had done it twice while he talked. It was a reflex she'd come to understand, not necessarily malicious, but impossible to ignore when you were on the receiving end of it. Gideon Thornridge had looked at her pulse point to take her pulse, and then he'd looked at her face, and that was the whole of it. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away for later when she had the capacity to think about it properly. "You should eat more than that," he said from across the room without looking at her. He was at the shelf doing something with a small cloth bag she couldn't identify from where she sat. "I know my limits," she said. "You were starving when I found you." "I know that too." She turned the cup between her palms. "I've treated starvation. I know what it does to a stomach. I'm pacing it." He turned around at that, and the look he gave her was one she couldn't quite read. Not skeptical, not impressed, something more neutral than either. Assessment, maybe, like he was filing something away too. "You a doctor?" he asked. "Healer," she said. "Settlement healer. Was." He seemed to understand the weight of that past tense without needing it explained. He nodded once and went back to what he was doing. She finished the broth. She didn't ask for more, even though she wanted it. Her body was making demands of her that her mind hadn't caught up to yet, and she needed her mind operational right now more than she needed her body satisfied. She set the cup down on the floor beside the chair and looked at the fire and let herself think about Thomas for the first time since the barn. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure she had the water for it. But she sat with the grief the way she'd sat with difficult patience, not trying to fix it, not trying to move past it, just being present with it, acknowledging it. He had been a good man. Not a perfect man. He'd had a stubborn streak that could last weeks. He'd struggled with the isolation of frontier life in ways he'd never admitted out loud. He'd made decisions she'd disagreed with and vice versa, and they'd fought about some of them with real heat. But he'd been good in the way that mattered most, which was that he'd been honest, and he'd stayed, and he'd stood in the doorway with her when the world decided it had no room for her. That deserved more than 30 seconds of grief in a stranger's cabin. She promised herself she'd give it what it deserved when she could afford to. "There's a pallet in the back," Gideon said. "You should sleep." "I don't know if I can." "Try anyway." He picked up the tin cup without being asked and moved it to the table. "Your feet need to stay elevated. There's a folded blanket. You can put it under your ankles." She looked at him. "You know something about cold injury." "I've been out here a long time," he said, which was not an answer exactly, but had the texture of one. She didn't sleep well. She slept in fragments, dropping into something that wasn't quite rest and then surfacing again, raw, disoriented, aware each time of where she was and why, which was worse than waking up not knowing. The pallet was rough but dry, and she was warm enough, which was more than she'd expected a few hours ago. Once, deep in the night, she heard Gideon moving around in the main room, and through the gap in the partition she saw the shadow of him tending the fire, making sure it didn't die down. He didn't know she was awake. I was just doing it because it needed doing. She closed her eyes and eventually found something that passed for sleep. Morning came in through a small high window and landed on her face, and for 2 whole seconds she forgot everything, and then she remembered, and the weight of it settled across her chest like something physical. She lay still under it for a moment. Then she sat up. Her feet ached dully, which was a good sign. Dull ache meant circulation, meant the tissue was recovering. She could feel all her toes distinctly, which she hadn't been able to say the night before. She stood carefully, tested her weight, found it manageable. Her body felt used up in a way that went beyond tired, the kind of depletion that lives in the muscles and the joints and the back of the eyes all at once. But she was upright. She was functional. Thomas was still dead. She was still alive. She wasn't sure yet how to relate those two facts to each other. She came through to the main room and found Gideon already up, already dressed, the fire built back to full strength. There was porridge in the pot. He didn't announce it. He just gestured at it with his chin when she appeared, the way people who live alone sometimes communicate because they've forgotten the social conventions for making others comfortable. She ate. He ate. They sat at the small table and ate in a silence that was not unfriendly. After a while, she said, "I need to go back for him." Gideon looked at her over his spoon. "Your husband. I can't leave him in that barn. He deserves to be buried properly. Ground's frozen solid, 3 feet down, maybe more." "I know what frozen ground is," she said, with more edge than she'd intended. She caught it. "I'm sorry, I know, but I still can't leave him there." Gideon set down his spoon. He looked at her for a moment with that same measuring expression, the one she was starting to understand meant he was taking something seriously. "When the ground breaks in spring," he said, "I'll help you do it right. I'll mark the place so we can find it again." He paused. "That's the best I can offer you right now, the best anyone can offer." She wanted to argue. There was a part of her that needed to argue, because arguing felt like action, and action felt like control, and she had none. But he was right, and she knew it, and she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "All right." "All right," he repeated, and picked up his spoon again. They lived in that careful way for 3 days, each of them moving around the small space with the awareness of someone who hasn't been close to another person in a while and is relearning the basic grammar of it. She helped with tasks she was able to do, preparing food, mending a tear in one of his coats that she found using a needle and thread from her satchel, maintaining the fire when he was outside for wood. She wasn't the kind of person who could sit still and be kept, not even when her body was still in the process of putting itself back together. Staying busy kept the grief at a manageable distance, not gone, not dealt with, just at a distance she could function within. On the second evening, she was sitting near the fire with her mother's journal open on her lap, not reading, just holding it. When Gideon came in from outside and set a load of wood down and stood there for a moment instead of moving, she looked up. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." He came and sat down in the other chair, the one across the fire from her. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at his hands for a moment before looking at her. "What did you do?" he asked. "To make them want you gone?" It was a blunt question. It would have been insulting coming from someone who meant it as an accusation. Coming from him, in that tone, direct and genuinely curious, not rhetorical, it landed differently. "Children died," she said. "A fever. I couldn't stop it." "That's not enough reason." "No," she agreed. "It usually isn't. But then you add the fear. They've been struggling all year, bad harvest, money problems, road closed. And you add 3 dead children, and then you need somewhere to put the weight of it. And I was there." She turned the journal over in her hands. "And I have this." She lifted her left wrist slightly, showing him. Not performing it, not making a statement, just showing him. He looked at it. He looked at it the way a person looks at a thing, just a mark on skin. "That's a birthmark," he said. "I know that." "They didn't." "They did," she said. "They chose not to." He was quiet. The fire shifted and resettled. "I had a wife," he said. She hadn't expected that. She waited. 7 years ago, he said. "Town I used to live in, 2 days south of here. She got sick. Nothing mysterious, she just got sick the way people do, and she died. Took about 4 months." He looked at the fire. "After she was gone, I couldn't figure out how to stay there. Too many people who wanted me to be a certain way about it. Wanted me to—" He paused, looking for the word. "Process it on their schedule. Get through it and get back to being normal so they didn't have to think about it anymore." He shook his head. "I'm not built that way." "So you came out here," Liora said, gradually. "A little farther each year." He glanced at her. "Sounds like running away. I know." "It sounds like surviving," she said. "People do what they need to do." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmly, exactly. Not in the way of a story that moves toward its heart, all in one clean motion. More like a door opened a crack, just enough to see there was something behind it. "Your settlement," he said. "Were they all against you?" "Not all," she said, "but enough. And the ones who weren't, they didn't stop it, which gets to be almost the same thing." "There's a man," he said. "Crest, Harmon Crest. You mentioned his granddaughter." She looked at him carefully. "You know him?" "I know of him. He trades through a post about a day east. I've heard his name." A pause. "He's the kind of man who organizes things." That's an accurate way to say it, she said. Gideon looked at the fire for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes. Something she couldn't read yet. Some piece of information he was connecting to something else. How long do you think before they decide they're not done with you? He said. The question landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. Not loud, but consequential, sending rings outward from the point of impact. She'd been trying not to think about it. She'd been trying to get through each hour as its own contained thing. I don't know, she said honestly. I hoped the distance would be enough. It might not be, he said. Not with a man like that. She closed her mother's journal. I know. The third day was when the dogs came. She heard them before she saw them. 3 of them, big working dogs, moving fast through the snow toward the cabin. Behind them came 4 men on horseback, close enough together to be moving as a unit rather than as individuals. She was at the window when they appeared through the tree line, and she said Gideon's name without raising her voice. He was beside her in 4 seconds, looking over her shoulder. He said something quiet that she didn't quite catch. Then he moved to the door. Stay inside, he said. Gideon, stay inside. He said it without looking back, without urgency, with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided what he's doing. He took his coat off the hook. He did not take the axe. He opened the door and stepped out. She pressed herself to the side of the window where she could see without being seen. There were 4 men. She recognized 2 of them, Aldous Webb, who ran the feed supply in Dunmore's Crossing, and a younger man named Dale Pritcher, whose family ran livestock on the eastern edge of the settlement. The other 2 she didn't know by name, but she'd seen their faces. All 4 of them were armed in the casual way of frontier men who didn't go anywhere without the means to handle trouble. Gideon stood in the snow in front of the cabin with his hands open at his sides. Thornridge, said Aldous Webb, pulling his horse to a stop about 10 yards out. He said the name like he'd heard it before, like he'd done enough preparation for this visit to know who he was talking to. Webb, Gideon said. His voice carried clearly through the window. You got someone inside? I've got my cabin inside, Gideon said. What I keep in it is my business. We're looking for a woman, Webb said. Healer from Dunmore's Crossing. She's wanted there. Wanted for what? Webb shifted in his saddle. She practiced dark work, caused the deaths of children. You have evidence of that? A pause. The horses moved slightly, restless. The dogs had stopped when the men stopped and were sitting in the snow in a line, watching Gideon with professional attention. We have consensus, Webb said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still level, but there was something in it now, a layer underneath the calm that had an edge to it. Consensus isn't evidence, he said, and this is my land. You're on my land right now without an invitation, and I'm going to ask you politely to turn those horses around. Webb's jaw worked. Thornridge, if you're hiding that woman, I'm not hiding anything, Gideon said. I'm standing in front of my cabin in my own yard. What I'm telling you is that you have no authority out here. This isn't your jurisdiction. Whatever your elder decides in that settlement is his business inside those borders, and this is not inside those borders. He paused. Go home, Aldous. The way he said the name, first name, flat and final, was different from the last time he'd used it. It was not friendly. It was a door being closed. Dale Pritcher moved his horse forward slightly, and Webb put out his arm to stop him. The 2 men looked at each other, the unspoken negotiation of a group that didn't have a clear plan for this outcome. One of the men she didn't know said quietly, We could just go in. You could try, Gideon said. He said it without raising his voice or changing his posture or doing anything that looked like a threat. He said it like a man stating a fact about the weather. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Aldous Webb turned his horse. This isn't finished, he said. Never said it was, Gideon replied. They went. Not fast. They went the way men go when they're leaving on their own terms, even though they're leaving, but they went. The dogs went with them. The sound of hooves in packed snow faded through the trees, and then there was just the wind again. Gideon stood in the yard until they were gone from sight. Then he came back inside. Liora was standing 2 feet from the door. She hadn't moved from the window to behind the door on purpose. Her feet had carried her there while her mind was occupied with watching. He closed the door and looked at her. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because they were wrong. He hung his coat back up. But they'll come back with more men, and I can't hold them off that way twice. He turned to look at her. I know somewhere we can go. There's a community in the northern range, people my family has known for generations. They keep to themselves and they don't have much tolerance for mob behavior. We'd be safe there while things settle. Would they take me? Someone they don't know? They'll take anyone I vouch for, he said. I haven't asked them for much. They'll trust me. She thought about this. About following a man she'd known for 3 days deeper into a wilderness that had already tried to kill her once. She thought about the alternative, staying here, waiting for Webb to come back with more men and a better plan. How far? She asked. 2 days. Maybe less if we push. She looked at her feet. She looked at the window. She looked at Gideon Thornridge, who had walked a mile in a blizzard to find out if the tracks in his field belonged to someone who needed help, and who had just stood in the snow and told 4 armed men to leave without flinching. When do we leave? She said. First light tomorrow, he said. Sleep while you can. I need to pack. She slept better that night. Not well. Well was not available to her yet, and wouldn't be for a while. But better. The fire held, and Gideon moved quietly around the main room, doing whatever he was doing, and she lay in the dark and let the grief have a little more room than she'd given it the night before. Let it move around inside her. Let herself think about Thomas's face, about the way he'd handed her the pack without arguing because he knew she was right, about the sound of his cough in the dark. She let herself be angry too, not at Thomas, never at Thomas. At Harmon Crest, who had looked at her across the body of his dead granddaughter and decided she needed to be punished for the universe's failure to be controllable. At Aldous Webb, who'd ridden 4 hours in winter weather with 3 dogs and 3 other men to drag her back to a community that wanted her dead. At every person who'd chosen the comfort of a target over the discomfort of uncertainty. She let herself be angry, and then she packed it away carefully, the way she packed medicines, organized, accessible, not left loose where it could spill and damage things. They left before the sun was fully up, in that blue-gray pre-dawn light that makes the snow look like it's generating its own glow. Gideon moved through the cold like he was part of it, like it was his element. Liora moved through it like someone who had decided she was going to be part of it, whether it wanted her or not. The trail north was rough in places and absent in others, navigable only by landmarks that Gideon read with the ease of someone who'd done this enough times that the landscape had become a kind of text. He didn't explain as he went, he just went, and she followed, and when the terrain shifted or a landmark appeared, he'd glance back at her briefly to confirm she was still there and still moving. Around midday they stopped to eat, dried meat, hard biscuit, water from a thin stream he cracked the ice off with the butt of his axe handle. They sat on a fallen log and ate without ceremony, and she was aware, sitting there in the silent cold with the trees around them and the sky a pale washed blue above, that she felt something she hadn't felt since the night they'd left the settlement. Not safe. She'd already told herself that word wasn't available to her yet, but present. She felt present. In this specific place, this specific cold, this specific moment, fully there in it, not buried under what had happened or what might happen. Just here. It lasted about 4 minutes, and then Gideon stood up and said, "We should keep moving." And she stood up, and they kept moving. The community appeared on the afternoon of the second day, tucked into a valley between 2 ridges in a way that made it nearly invisible until you were almost inside it. Leora's first impression was of smoke, multiple chimneys, the warm, layered smell of wood fires and cooked food, and then structures, built low and tight against the hillside in the manner of people who understood that wind is the enemy and low profiles survive it better. People came out to meet them. Not a crowd, 4 or 5 individuals, moving with the wary ease of people who were comfortable in their environment and used to assessing newcomers without malice. A woman in her 60s reached them first. Broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with the face of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to waste energy on pretense. "Gideon," she said. Not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement. Her eyes went to Liora immediately. "Eleanor," he said. "This is Liora Ashcroft. She needs shelter." Eleanor looked at Liora in the direct appraising way of someone who would decide things for herself regardless of what she was told. Her eyes traveled over Liora, her face, her hands, the way she was standing, Things Liora understood because she did the same thing herself when she was trying to understand what she was dealing with. "What happened to your feet?" Eleanor said. "Cold injury," Liora said. "Partial. They're recovering." "You treat them yourself?" "Yes." "Healer?" "Settlement healer." Was. Eleanor made a sound that could have been a great many things. "Settlement healers," she said. "I knew one, 60 years ago." She looked at Gideon briefly. "She's vouched for?" "She is," he said. Eleanor looked back at Liora. "Then come inside," she said. "You look like you need feeding." Liora almost said she was fine. Almost. Instead, she said, "Yes, thank you." Eleanor's home was larger than Gideon's cabin, built for community rather than solitude, with a main room big enough to seat 8 or 10, a long table along one wall, shelves of food stores, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the beams in a way that made Leora's hand itch for her own satchel. She looked at those herb bundles and felt something strange, recognition, familiarity, in a place she'd never been. The small comfort of knowing that whatever else was uncertain, she understood what the people here valued and why. Eleanor put food in front of her and sat down across the table and said, "Tell me what happened." So Liora told her. Not everything. Not yet. Not to a woman she'd known for an hour. But the shape of it, the outline, the fever, the deaths, the accusations, the night they left, Thomas in the barn. She told it in the flat, factual way she told difficult things, keeping her voice steady, not asking for comfort because she wasn't sure she'd know what to do with it. Eleanor listened without interrupting. At the end, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Who led them against you?" "A man called Harmon Crest." Eleanor's expression shifted slightly. "I've heard that name," she said. Gideon said the same. "His reach is long for a man who claims to be a simple elder." She folded her hands on the table. "He won't stop because you left. You understand that." "I'm starting to," Liora said. "He'll follow you here eventually, or send someone." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "When that happens, you'll have choices to make, about how to face it." "I know." "Do you?" Liora looked at her. "I've been making hard choices since I was 17 years old, and my mother handed me a medical journal and said the community needed a healer more than I needed a normal life." She kept her voice even. "I know what hard choices look like." Eleanor studied her for a moment, then something in her face relaxed, not by much, but perceptibly. "Good," she said. "Then you'll be useful here while you're staying." It was not kindness exactly, or not only that, it was acceptance of a specific kind, practical, conditional, on contribution, extended without sentimentality. Liora understood it perfectly. It was the kind of acceptance she knew how to live inside. Gideon was standing near the door, watching this exchange with the expression of a man who had known Eleanor for a long time and was confirming something he'd already expected to be true. When he caught Leora's eye, he nodded once, slightly, and then he went outside. She stayed at the table and finished her food and listened to the sounds of the community around her. Voices in other rooms, children somewhere in the back of the building, the particular domestic texture of a place where people have learned to live alongside each other through agreement rather than accident. She thought about Dunmore's crossing, about the way it had felt, before everything. The mornings walking between houses, knowing the names and histories and ailments of almost everyone she'd pass. The exhaustion of it, and the purpose that lived inside the exhaustion. The sense that what she did mattered in a way she could see and measure. She'd lost that. She knew she had. Whatever came next, that specific version of her life was over, and she was going to have to grieve it the same way she was going to have to grieve Thomas, piece by piece, as she could afford to, without letting the grief make her stupid or reckless or small. But sitting here, in this room that smelled like dried yarrow and wood smoke and someone's stew on the fire, she felt something that had been absent for so long she'd forgotten to miss it. She felt like she was somewhere a person could start over. Not safe. She corrected herself again, almost automatically, almost with humor. Not safe. Not yet. The men who'd come to Gideon's cabin would come again. Harmon Crest, with his long reach and his organized certainty, was not a man who let things go. The winter was still outside every door and window, patient and without mercy. But she was alive. She was warm. She was fed. She had her mother's journal in the satchel at her feet and the full inventory of her own knowledge intact in her mind. And she was sitting across from a woman who had looked at her and asked what she could do rather than who she was. And somewhere in the structure of the building around her, people who didn't yet know her name were going about their lives. And maybe some of them were sick, and maybe some of them were scared, and maybe some of them needed exactly what she knew how to do. She picked up her spoon and finished her meal. She stayed useful. That was the deal she made with herself in those first days inside Eleanor's Valley, and she kept it the way she kept most things she decided, without announcing it, without making it into anything larger than it was, just doing it every morning when she got up and put her feet on the cold floor and asked herself what needed doing. There was always something. The community in the valley, Eleanor's people, as Gideon called them without particular ownership in the phrase, ran on the logic of shared labor, which meant that uselessness was the only thing that would actually make her unwelcome. She understood that instinctively, the way she understood most things about how communities worked, because she'd spent 6 years being the person a community needed, and she knew what that required. She started small. She helped with meal preparation, which was communal, and ran on a rotation that she inserted herself into without being asked. She repaired things: a broken chair leg, a coat with the lining coming loose, small domestic damage that accumulated in any household where people were focused on larger tasks. She was careful about the medicine, not because she was hiding what she knew, but because offering it too soon in a new place was the kind of presumption that people resented, and she needed to understand this community's rhythms before she started reshaping them. But the knowledge was there, right behind her eyes, every time she watched someone move wrong or heard a cough that went on too long. It was not something she could turn off. On the 5th day, a boy of about 12 named Kyle came into the main room holding his left arm against his body in the particular way that meant the pain was centered in the elbow. His mother, a quiet, capable woman named Sarah, was behind him, her face carrying the careful blankness of a parent who is frightened and is not going to show it in front of her child. Liora was at the table with her mother's journal open, doing the thing she did when she needed to feel tethered to something, reading the handwriting, not always the content, just the handwriting, which was her mother's and therefore familiar in a way that the rest of her current world was not. She closed the journal. "Can I look at it?" she asked Cale. He glanced at his mother. Sarah nodded slightly. "Sure," he said, with the elaborate casualness of a 12-year-old who is in significant pain and would die before admitting it. She looked at the arm carefully, palpating along the joint, watching his face for involuntary reactions rather than asking him to report pain levels, because children reported what they thought adults wanted to hear. It was a bad sprain, severe enough that the ligament had probably stretched past comfortable tolerances, but not a break. She was 90% certain, and she said so. 90%, Sarah repeated. The other 10% means I'd feel better if I could check it in a day or so, when the swelling's gone down a little. Right now it's obscuring the detail. She looked at Cale. "How'd you do it?" "Fell," he said. "Off what?" A pause. "The roof of the storage shed." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "What were you doing on the roof of the storage shed?" Liora asked. "Nothing," he said, in the tone of someone who had been doing something very specific. "Right." She looked at his mother. "I can splint it properly and give him something for the pain and the swelling. Arnica and willow bark. I have both in my kit. He needs to keep it elevated for 2 days and not use it for a week." "Thank you," Sarah said. She said it simply, without the complicated texture that gratitude sometimes carries when it's mixed with obligation or debt. Just thank you. Liora felt something in her chest ease by a small degree. She treated the arm. She did it on the table in the main room, which meant Eleanor saw it, and 2 other community members who happened to pass through, and by evening the fact of what she knew had distributed itself through the valley in the efficient way of information in small communities without anyone needing to announce it. She didn't mind. It was in fact exactly how she'd hoped it would go. Gideon had been around and not around in those first days, present for meals, present in the evenings, but spending his days doing the kind of outdoor work that took him into the woods and the valley edges for hours at a time. She understood that this was his normal, that he lived his life with a large portion of it spent in his own company, and she didn't interpret his absence as distance. But she noticed when he was there. She was honest enough with herself to notice that she noticed. He was a careful person, she'd decided. Not cautious, careful. There was a difference. Cautious was fear wearing the clothing of prudence. Careful was something that came from paying attention, from understanding that things broke when you weren't present to them. He was careful with objects, his tools, the cabin structure, the way he cut and stacked wood. He was careful with words. He didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't say more than he meant, which in her experience was rare enough to be remarkable. And he was careful with her, in a way that was neither intrusive nor distant, that gave her exactly the amount of room she needed without making her feel invisible. One evening, about a week into their stay, she found him outside after dinner on the eastern edge of the community, standing at the tree line looking at nothing in particular. She came and stood beside him because the alternative was going back inside and she wasn't tired enough for that yet. "You're worried," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "Those are the same face on you." He glanced at her. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his features, not enough to call it that, but something in the direction of it. "Webb came back to the cabin," he said. "Someone in the community told me this morning. They passed by 2 days ago. 6 men this time, not 4. She absorbed this. "They found it empty." "Yes, but they'll start looking farther out." He paused. "Eleanor knows a man, a regional investigator. Someone with actual authority, the kind that can make Crest's mob illegal rather than just wrong." He looked at the trees. "She's trying to reach him. It'll take time." "How much time?" "I don't know, a week? Maybe more. Maybe less if the weather holds and the messenger rides hard." He turned to look at her. "Can you sit still for that long?" "I've been sitting still for a week," she said. "You've been keeping busy for a week. That's different." She thought about arguing and didn't. He was right and she knew it. Keeping busy was what she did with stillness, because actual stillness was where the grief lived and the anger lived and the questions she didn't have answers to yet lived, and she'd been managing them by staying in motion. "I can do what I need to do," she said. "That wasn't the question." She looked at him. "I know what the question was." He looked back at her without pressing it, without filling the silence the way some people did. He just let it be a question that didn't need answering right now, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't say. "Tell me about your wife," she said, because she'd been wanting to ask for several days and had been waiting for the right moment, and this felt like it might be one. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, processing, the way people do when they're deciding how much of something to give. "Her name was Nora," he said. "She was a school teacher. She came to the town to teach and ended up staying, which was not what she'd planned. She'd planned to save money and go back east. But she stayed." A pause. "She was nothing like me. She talked all the time. Not empty talking, real talking, the kind where she was actually thinking and the words were just the outside of the thinking. She could argue about anything. She had opinions about everything." He shook his head, and there was something in the gesture that was not grief exactly, but the residue of it, the shape grief leaves when it's had years to settle into something more livable. "I used to get frustrated with her talking. Now I'd give—" He stopped. "I know," Liora said. He looked at her. "I know what you were going to say," she said. "I'd give anything to hear Thomas be stubborn about something stupid again. He had opinions about how to stack firewood. Specific opinions. He'd restack it if he thought you'd done it wrong." She paused. "I used to think it was maddening." "Yes," Gideon said. "Exactly like that." They stood in the cold for another few minutes after that, not talking, looking at the tree line. It was not uncomfortable. It was the specific comfort of being with someone who understands what you're carrying without requiring you to display it. She went inside first. He stayed outside a little longer. Neither of them mentioned the conversation the next day, which was also the right thing. The news arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a young man on a horse who'd ridden from the direction of the eastern settlement in weather that had turned and gone punishing again overnight. He came into Eleanor's main room with snow in his collar and his face wind raw, and he sat down and drank hot water because the tea wasn't ready yet, and he didn't want to wait, and he told them what he'd heard. The livestock sickness had spread. 3 farms on the western side of Dunmore's Crossing had lost animals: cattle, 2 horses, a large number of pigs. A pattern that had started 2 weeks ago as individual incidents had compounded into something that looked coordinated. Though it wasn't coordinated, it was just spreading. And in the last 5 days, children in the settlement had started getting sick again. Different from the original fever, different symptoms, different progression. More children than before. The settlement was frightened in the particular way of people who believed they were being punished and couldn't identify what they'd done wrong. Harmon Crest had told them what they'd done wrong. They'd let the witch escape. Eleanor listened to all of this with her arms folded and her face very still. When the young man finished, she thanked him and sent him to the kitchen for food and looked across the room at Liora. "Well," she said. "Tell me about the children's symptoms," Liora said. Eleanor looked at the young man who had paused at the kitchen doorway. "Stomach cramping," he said. "Vomiting. Blue at the fingers and lips again, same as before. Some with swelling around the throat." Liora went very still. The swelling around the throat was new. That was not a fever symptom. That was not the same illness as before. And blue fingers and lips combined with severe gastric symptoms and throat swelling. She was running the combination through her knowledge quickly, turning it over, looking at it from different directions the way she did when a presentation didn't fit any single clean diagnosis. There was one thing it fit. "Is there a river that runs through the settlement?" she asked Eleanor. "Or near it?" "There's the Gallon Creek," the young man said from the doorway. "Comes down from the North Ridge. Everybody uses it." "Where does it come from? What's upstream?" He frowned. "The ridge. Trees, mostly. There used to be a mining operation up there before I was born, I think. Been closed a long time." Liora looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her. "You know what it is?" "I have a theory," Liora said carefully, because theories weren't certainties, and she'd learned hard lessons about the cost of certainty that turned out to be wrong. "I need information I don't have yet, but if I'm right—" She paused. "If I'm right, then the children in Dunmore's Crossing are going to keep getting sick, and some of them are going to die, and it has nothing to do with me and nothing to do with any curse or mark or whatever Harmon Crest is telling people." The room was quiet. Gideon was standing near the back wall. She hadn't heard him come in, but he was there now. He was watching her with an expression she was starting to be able to read. Intent, not surprised, the face of someone keeping up with a situation that is moving fast. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to go back," she said. The silence that followed that statement had a particular quality, like the air just before a storm commits to what it's going to be. "Liora," Eleanor said. "Not to stay. Not to give Crest what he wants." She looked at Eleanor, then at Gideon, then at the young man still standing in the doorway with his coat still on. "I need to go back because those are sick children, and I'm the only person in range who has any chance of understanding what's killing them. And if I'm right about the cause, the only way to stop it is to make the settlement understand it, really understand it, with evidence they can't dismiss." "Crest will have you the moment you show your face," Eleanor said. "Probably," Liora said. "But the children will keep dying if I don't." Eleanor looked at her for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up again and was pressing against the walls in the way it did when it was making a point. "You're certain enough to risk that?" Eleanor said. "I'm certain enough that children are dying of something preventable," Liora said. "That's all I need to be certain of." Gideon pushed off from the wall. "Then I'm going with you," he said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. His voice was level, but there was iron in it, the kind of iron that's not aggressive but is also not movable. "I'm going with you." She looked at him. She thought about arguing. She thought about what it would mean to walk back into Dunmore's Crossing alone, with Harmon Crest's men somewhere between here and there, with nothing but her knowledge and her wrist and her mother's journal. "All right," she said. They left the next morning before the valley was fully awake. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the main building and watched them go with the expression of a woman who had seen many difficult departures and had learned that commentary rarely improved them. She said nothing as they passed. At the edge of the tree line, Liora looked back once, and Eleanor raised her hand, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement. Liora turned back to the trail and kept walking. The 2 days south moved differently than the 2 days north had. She was stronger now, her feet fully healed, her body recovered from the worst of what the cold had done to it. She walked with her full stride and felt the weight of the medicine satchel as something purposeful rather than desperate. The wilderness around them was the same wilderness that had nearly killed her 6 weeks ago, and she moved through it now with a different relationship to it. Not comfortable exactly, not foolish about what it could do, but not afraid of it either. Gideon moved beside her the way he always moved, which was to say with economy and attention, saying little, present to the trail and the surroundings in a way that she found genuinely reassuring. He'd brought the axe, carried across his back. He'd also brought a second item she hadn't seen before. A short, heavy firearm, old-looking but maintained, tucked into his coat. She didn't ask about it. She understood its purpose. They talked sometimes when the trail was flat and the wind allowed it. She told him more about her mother, about the journal and where it had come from, about the years of following her mother through settlements and learning the work at her side before she'd known it was a vocation rather than just what her family did. He listened in the way he listened, which was with real attention, asking questions that proved he'd been following rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He told her about the logging work he'd done in his early years, before Nora, before the town, when he'd moved through the Northern Territory with crews of men who lived rough and valued competence above everything else. He'd been good at the work. He'd been less good at the life around the work, the drinking, the fighting, the particular performative masculinity of men who had nothing to prove but proved it constantly. "You don't seem like that now," she said. "No," he agreed. "Losing Nora changed some things. Being out here alone changed other things." He paused. "Solitude teaches you what's actually necessary and what you were only doing because you thought other people were watching." "That's accurate," she said. "You're not surprised." "I'm a frontier healer," she said. "I've spent 6 years in rooms with people at their worst. I know what gets stripped away when the stakes are real." She glanced at him. "What's left when everything's stripped away tells you everything." He looked at her sidelong. "What's left in you?" She thought about it honestly. "Stubbornness," she said. "Knowledge I don't know how to not use. Anger that I'm still working on directing productively." A pause. "And some grief that I haven't finished with yet." "That's not a bad inventory," he said. "It's honest," she said, "which is the best I can do." They were a half-day's ride from the edge of Dunmore's Crossing territory when they found the creek. Or rather, when they found what the creek had become. She smelled it first. A faint metallic tang in the air that didn't belong to winter or wood or any natural thing. She stopped walking and Gideon stopped beside her without needing to ask why, and she turned her face into the faint breeze and confirmed it. "Do you smell that?" she asked. He breathed in. His expression shifted. "What is it?" "Sulfate compound," she said. "Or something close. Mining runoff has that particular—" She was already moving toward the sound of water. "Come on." The Gallon Creek ran through a shallow cut about 40 yards east of the trail. She reached it and crouched at the bank and looked at the water in the gray winter light, and what she saw tightened something in her chest. The water was clear at the surface. Looked fine, even. But along the banks, where the water was shallower and slower, there was a yellowish-orange discoloration on the stones, a staining that built up in layers like something deposited over time. And the smell was stronger here, that metallic, acidic quality that she recognized now with certainty because she'd read about it in a public health document that had come through the settlement 2 years ago, passed along by a traveling physician who'd been dealing with mining contamination in the south. Heavy metal leaching. Runoff from an abandoned or active mining operation upstream carrying compounds into the water supply, accumulating slowly in people and animals who drank from the same source day after day. Not dramatic enough to notice all at once, insidious enough to build over weeks and months until the accumulation crossed a threshold. Blue fingers, blue lips, severe cramping, throat swelling in some cases. All of it consistent with a specific kind of heavy metal toxicity that she'd read about but never treated because the settlements she'd worked in had clean water. She stood up. "The mine," she said. "The one the boy mentioned, been closed a long time. Except it hasn't been closed. Or it was closed badly, without proper remediation, and it's been leaching into this creek for years, maybe longer, and it's gotten worse recently. Heavy rainfall upstream, or someone's disturbed the site, or—" She stopped herself. "The point is, this is what's killing the children. This is what killed the animals. And this is what killed the 3 children who died during the so-called epidemic that Crest blamed on me." Gideon crouched where she'd crouched and looked at the water and the staining. "How do you prove it?" he said. "The staining on the stones is visible evidence. The smell is detectable. And if I can get water samples to the right person, the investigator Eleanor was trying to reach, he can have them tested by someone with the proper equipment." She looked at the creek. "But first I have to get to the settlement and get people to listen to me for long enough to explain it, which is going to require walking into a crowd of people who want to hurt you. Gideon said. Yes, she said. That. He stood up and looked at her. I've walked into worse situations, he said. Have you? Probably not, he said, but I'm coming anyway. The edge of Dunmore's crossing proper came into view in the late afternoon of the second day, and the first thing Liora noticed was how different it looked from the settlement she'd left 6 weeks ago. Not structurally, the buildings were the same, the layout unchanged, but the atmosphere was different in a way that was visible even from the trail. Smoke from too many fires in the middle of the day, which meant people were gathered in groups indoors. Fewer animals in the visible pens. A quality of held-breath stillness, the particular stillness of a community that is afraid and doesn't know what to be afraid of. She and Gideon came to the edge of the first cluster of buildings and stopped. How do you want to do this? He said. She'd been thinking about it for 2 days. She'd turned it over from every angle she could find, and she'd come to the same conclusion every time, which was that there was no careful version. There was no approach that minimized the risk of confrontation, because Harmon Crest would manufacture confrontation regardless of how she approached. The only choice available to her was where and when, and she wanted it to be her choice. Is there somewhere people gather? She said. A central place? There's a common area, Gideon said. Near the mill. I've passed through here once or twice. Take me there, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, and they walked forward into the settlement. People saw her before she'd gone 20 yards. She saw the recognition hit, saw it in the way a woman drawing water from a barrel, looked up and went rigid, saw it in the quick, sharp movement of a man near the mill building who turned and raised his voice, calling for something she couldn't hear clearly from this distance. She kept walking. The common area was a tramped-down rectangle of ground between the mill and what appeared to be a meeting hall, bordered on 2 sides by buildings and open to the street on the other 2. When she reached it, there were perhaps 15 people already there from the commotion, and more coming, drawn by the shouting, by whatever signal had moved through the settlement in the minutes since she'd stepped into it. Harmon Crest appeared from the direction of the meeting hall. He looked older than she remembered. 6 weeks of fear and grief had done something to the man, sharpened some planes of his face, and deepened others. He was still the same Harmon Crest, organized, certain, the kind of man whose certainty was the thing that made him dangerous. But he looked like certainty had been costing him something he hadn't expected to pay. He stopped when he saw her, and the crowd around her went quiet with the particular efficiency of people watching something they've been waiting for. You came back, he said. I came back, she said. You're a brave woman, he said, or a foolish one. Neither, she said. I'm a healer, and your children are dying, and I know why. The crowd's silence shifted quality, still quiet, but differently quiet, the kind that has attention in it rather than just waiting. We know why, Crest said. He raised his voice slightly, not shouting but projecting, the voice of a man who'd run meetings for years. You brought this sickness to us the first time. You ran from your punishment, and now the sickness is back, and you've come back with it. That's wrong, Liora said. She kept her own voice even and clear. Not loud. She didn't need loud. The crowd was close enough. And I can show you it's wrong. I can show every person standing here exactly what is killing your children and your animals, and it has nothing to do with me. She's lying, Crest said. You know what she is. You've seen the mark. A birthmark, said a voice from the crowd. Everyone looked. A woman about Liora's age. She didn't recognize the face, but recognized the type who had been quiet for a long time and had just run out of quiet. It's a birthmark, the woman said again, louder this time. My cousin has one on his shoulder, and nobody's calling him a witch. That's different, Crest started. How is it different? The woman said. The crowd's quality shifted again. These weren't Crest's people uniformly. She could see it now, looking at the faces, reading the variations. Frightened people were not the same as convinced people. Some of them had been going along because going along felt safer than pushing back. But fear, when it goes on long enough, starts to look for somewhere new to land. The creek, Liora said, loud enough to carry now. The Gallon Creek. That's where this starts. She had their attention. She felt it, the way she always felt a room shifting toward her when she was explaining something that mattered. The mining operation on the North Ridge, the old one, everyone says it's been closed for years. It hasn't been properly closed. The waste is leaching into the Gallon Creek. Slowly, over a long time, slowly enough that you didn't notice it building. But it's been building, and it's in your water, and that is what is killing your animals and making your children sick. She looked directly at Harmon Crest. Not a fever, not a witch. Poison in your water supply that has been getting worse for years. Crest's face had gone through several things while she spoke. It had gone through contempt and through the beginning of counter-argument, and then through something else, something that wasn't belief, not yet, but was the crack in certainty that comes before belief becomes possible. That's not, he started. Go to this creek, she said. Walk to the Gallon Creek and look at the stones along the bank. There's a discoloration, orange and yellow staining. Smell the water. You'll smell something that doesn't belong to clean water. She looked at the crowd. Somebody here has been to that creek recently. Somebody here has seen it. Silence. And then a man near the back of the crowd, older, heavy-set, with the permanent squint of someone who worked outdoors, said, I've smelled something off it a few weeks back. Thought it was animal, something dead upstream. It's not animal, Liora said. It's mineral runoff, heavy metal compounds from the mine site. They accumulate in the body over time. They cause exactly the symptoms your children are showing, the cramping, the blue discoloration, the throat swelling in the worst cases. The heavy-set man looked at Crest. Crest looked at Liora. And I suppose you can cure it, Crest said. His voice had shifted, still resistant, but the certainty in it had changed texture. I can treat the symptoms and reduce exposure if you stop using the creek immediately, she said. But what you really need is someone with authority to investigate the mine site and hold whoever is responsible for it accountable. She looked at Crest steadily. Because someone knew about this. Mining waste doesn't leach like this without someone cutting corners on closure. Someone made a decision that your children would bear the cost of. The crowd was making noise now, not mob noise, not yet, but the sound of people processing something that was reorganizing their understanding of their situation. She could see it in faces. The calculation, the reevaluation, the particular expression of people who've been given an answer that fits better than the answer they had. Crest was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't capitulation. This man did not capitulate easily. But it was something. Then a woman screamed from the direction of the residential buildings. It was a short, sharp scream, the kind that has specific content rather than just fear. And everyone in the common area turned toward it simultaneously. A girl came running, 12, maybe 13, her coat half on and her face white with a particular urgency that Liora recognized immediately. My brother, she said, gasping, looking at the crowd and landing on Liora without seeming to know why, just finding the face that looked most likely to help. He was fine this morning, and now he can't. He's on the floor, and he can't. Liora was already moving. She pushed through the crowd without apology. Gideon was a step behind her. She heard Crest's voice behind them saying something she didn't catch, and she didn't stop to hear it because there was a child on a floor somewhere in this settlement, and that was the only thing that mattered right now. The girl led them fast through 2 alleys between buildings and to a house with the door standing open, the way doors get left open when someone runs out in a panic. Inside, on the floor near the hearth, was a boy of about 9, conscious but barely, his lips the particular bluish color she'd come to know, and the muscles of his abdomen clearly contracted even from the doorway. She was on the floor beside him before the girl had finished explaining. How long since he last drank water? She asked. This morning. He had water this morning. From the creek? Yes, we always... The girl stopped. Is that... How long has he been like this? Maybe an hour. I thought he was sleeping. He was so still. Liora opened her satchel. Her hands knew what they were doing without conscious direction. She found the activated charcoal preparation she kept for poisoning cases, and the dried milk thistle, and the compound she used for gastric distress. She looked up at Gideon, who was in the doorway. I need clean water, not from the creek. Is there a well here, a separate well, not connected to the creek feed? I'll find one, he said, and he was gone. Behind her in the doorway she heard more people arriving. The girl. Someone else. And then a voice she recognized, Harmon Crest, standing at the threshold of the house where his granddaughter had never been brought back, looking at a boy on the floor who was being treated by the woman he'd tried to kill. She did not look at him. She had work to do. Will he live? Crest said. His voice was different from anything she'd heard in it before. stripped of its organization, its projection, its certainty, just a man asking a question he was afraid of. She looked at the boy. She assessed what she saw. She was honest with herself about the margins. "If we caught it in time," she said, "and if we get him off the contaminated water immediately." She looked up at Crest then, briefly, directly. "Same as the others. Same as the ones before. They weren't cursed, they were poisoned, and they needed a healer." She looked back at the boy. "They needed me." Crest said nothing. Gideon came back with clean water from a well at the eastern edge of the settlement. Separate feed, he'd confirmed with the homeowner, no connection to the creek. She administered the first treatment, watching the boy's responses, adjusting, staying present to every small signal his body was sending. The girl sat on the floor beside her brother and held his hand and didn't get in the way, which was the most useful thing she could have done. The crowd outside the door had grown. She could hear it without looking, the murmur of it, the shifting weight of a group of people standing in the cold because they needed to know what was happening inside this room. The boy's color began to change. Slightly, gradually, the blue at his lips moving back towards something closer to normal. His breathing, which had been shallow and effortful, deepened by a degree. She watched it happen and felt something she never let herself feel until it was earned, the cautious, provisional relief of a practitioner who has intervened in time. She sat back on her heels and let herself breathe. "He's stable," she said. "For now, he needs monitoring, clean water, and the treatment continued for 3 days." She looked at the girl. Can you do that? Can you follow instructions exactly?" "Yes," the girl said. She was still holding her brother's hand. "Yes, I can." Liora began explaining the regimen, methodical and clear, watching the girl's face to confirm comprehension. She was aware of Crest still in the doorway. She was aware of the crowd outside. She was aware of Gideon leaning against the wall to her left, present and quiet, the way he always was. She finished the instructions. She closed her satchel. She stood up from the floor, which was harder than it should have been because her knees had stiffened in the cold. Then she turned and looked at Harmon Crest. He was looking at the boy on the floor, looking at the color coming back into the boy's face, looking at the thing that had been done here with knowledge and preparation and clean water and no ritual and no darkness and no mark that meant anything at all. He looked at her. She waited. He had no more words. She could see it in him. The architecture of his certainty had taken a structural blow and hadn't collapsed yet, because structures like that don't collapse all at once. They go in stages over days and weeks. But the blow had landed. "What do we do?" he said finally. He said it to the room, or to her, or to no one in particular. "Stop using the creek," she said. "Tonight. Every household, tonight. I'll put together a list of what I need from anyone who has the materials, and I'll start treating the other sick children in the morning." She looked at him directly. "And you get word to the regional authorities about the mine site. Someone has to answer for this." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the crowd noise had changed. It had quieted, but in a way that was listening rather than waiting. "You came back," he said again. Like the first time he'd said it, but different in meaning. "Someone had to," she said. She turned away from him and looked at Gideon. He looked back at her with an expression she was learning to read. Not quite approval, not quite admiration, but something in the territory of both, arrived at slowly and held with the particular weight of things that were actually meant. She picked up her satchel. There were more children to see. She worked through the night. That was the simple fact of it, stripped of any drama. She worked through the night because there were 8 children in Dunmore's Crossing showing active symptoms of heavy metal toxicity, and 2 of them were severe enough that she wasn't willing to leave them unattended for the hours it would take to sleep and come back. She moved between houses the way she had during the original epidemic, 6 weeks ago. The one that had started all of this. The same streets, the same doors, the same cold pressing down from above. But everything else was different. The doors opened now. That was the thing she noticed most, the thing that sat in her chest with a complicated weight she couldn't quite name. Every door she came to opened before she had to knock twice. Gideon stayed with her. She'd told him once, around midnight, that he didn't have to, that she knew where she was going and the immediate threat had shifted enough that she didn't need a physical escort. He'd looked at her and said nothing and kept walking beside her, and she'd decided arguing wasn't worth the time it would take. The most critical case was a girl named Maeve, 4 years old, who'd been sick for 3 days before anyone understood what was happening, and whose throat swelling had progressed to the point where Liora spent 40 minutes doing the most delicate work she'd done in years, managing the airway with the tools she had in her satchel and the knowledge she'd carried in her head since her mother had taught her that small airways were the most unforgiving things in medicine, and you did not get a second chance. Maeve's mother sat on the floor beside the small bed and watched Leora's hands with an expression that was pure concentrated need, the specific face of a parent who has given everything they have to the universe and is waiting to find out if it was enough. It was enough. Barely. The margin was tighter than Liora liked, and she said so to no one, just held it in her own assessment as a data point. Maeve's breathing eased. The color came back. The mother made a sound that was below speech, something that came from the body before the mind caught up with it. Liora stayed until she was certain the stabilization would hold. Then she moved to the next house. By the time gray light was coming through the eastern windows of the settlement, she had seen all 8 children and treated 5 of them with the materials she'd requested from households who had the components. Materials she'd itemized from memory, organized by priority, and sent runners to collect while she began work. 3 of the children were stable enough that she left detailed instructions with family members she'd assessed as capable of following them precisely. The other 5 she would need to revisit before midday. She came out of the last house into the pale morning cold and stood still for a moment, just stood there on the frozen ground with the satchel over her shoulder and the exhaustion hitting her all at once in the way it always did when the work stopped. Not during, never during, but the moment she stepped back from it, the body presented its invoice for everything it had lent her overnight. Gideon was leaning against the wall of the building opposite, arms crossed, watching her. "You need to eat," he said. "I need to sit down first," she said. "You can sit down and eat at the same time." She looked at him. He looked back at her without any particular apology for being practical when she was tired. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't resent it. "Where?" she said. He'd found the settlement's small kitchen building sometime during the night, a communal space that was already occupied by 2 older women starting the morning bread, who looked at Liora when she came through the door with the particular expression of women who have been awake since before dawn processing recent events and have formed preliminary conclusions. One of them, without saying anything, put a bowl of porridge in front of her while the other kept working at the bread. The gesture had no ceremony to it, just food appearing in front of a person who needed food. Liora ate. Gideon sat across from her and ate the same. Neither of them talked. The sound of the bread being worked filled the room, which was warm from the ovens, and the warmth was a physical relief she let herself feel without guilt. After a while, the woman who'd served them came and sat down at the end of the table. She was perhaps 70, with the face of someone who'd been watching things for a long time. I remember you from before," she said to Liora. "Before all this. You came to my neighbor's house when her husband had the lung sickness, 3 winters ago." "I remember," Liora said. She did. Ednar Holst, 44 years old, chest infection that had gone too deep by the time anyone called her. She'd been able to slow it, but not stop it. He'd lived another 4 months. "You sat with him," the woman said. "She told me. When nobody else would sit in the room because they were afraid of catching it. You sat with him and held his hand and talked to him." Liora didn't answer. There was nothing to add to it. "I knew about the birthmark thing before Crest made it official," the old woman said. "The rumors were going around for weeks before the meeting. I thought—" She paused, looking down at her hands. "I thought someone would stop it before it got as far as it got." She looked up. "I should have been that person." Liora looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to say and discarded several things and then said what was true. "Yes," she said. "You should have." The woman received this without flinching. She nodded once, slowly, and got back up and went back to the bread. Gideon was watching Liora from across the table. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You have a look." "I don't have a look." "You do," she said. "It's the look you get when you're deciding whether to say something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Most people would have been more comfortable with her, said something easier." "Easier doesn't help her," Liora said, "and it doesn't help the next person in her position who's deciding whether to speak up or stay quiet. Comfortable answers keep producing the same outcomes." I know, he said. I'm not criticizing. I'm... He stopped. What? He looked at her across the table. I'm trying to get used to you, he said, to how you are. It's not a complaint, it's just an adjustment. She looked at him. There was something in the directness of it that she wasn't sure how to hold, not uncomfortable but not simple either. Something that occupied more space than it seemed like it should for a sentence that small. I'm not particularly gentle, she said. I was before, more than I am now. The last 6 weeks. She paused. Some of the softness got used up. I'm not looking for gentle, he said. I've been living alone in the wilderness for 7 years. I'm not looking for gentle. She looked at him for another moment, and then looked back at her porridge and finished it. And they didn't talk about it again, but the conversation sat between them in the particular way of things said honestly in the early morning that you can't take back and don't want to. The investigator arrived on the 3rd day. His name was Marcus Hale, no relation to the Mrs. Hale, whose baby Liora had delivered, though when she heard the name she felt a reflex of recognition before she sorted it out. And he came with 2 assistants and the particular bearing of a regional authority figure who had seen enough frontier settlements to be unimpressed by the specific brand of chaos each one generated. He was a compact man in his 40s with a gray beard kept neater than most, and a way of looking at things, objects, and people alike that suggested he was already categorizing them before they finished presenting themselves to him. Eleanor had reached him through the same young man who'd arrived in the valley with the news of the spreading sickness. Eleanor Liora had come to understand, had a network of contacts that extended well beyond the geographic logic of where she lived, built over decades through a simple philosophy of being reliably useful to people who might one day need to be reliably useful back. Hale came to find Liora before he'd been in the settlement an hour. She was at Gideon's cabin. They'd moved her treatment operation there because it was easier to manage a single location than to keep moving between households. And Gideon had converted the main room into what was functionally a medical space without complaint, just rearranging the furniture with the wordless practicality she'd come to expect from him. There were 3 children currently being monitored in the back area with their parents, the most critical cases staying under direct observation until she was certain enough of their trajectory to release them to home care. Hale came through the door, looked around the room, looked at Liora, and said, "You're the healer." "I am," she said. "Eleanor says you identified the contamination source." "I identified symptoms consistent with heavy metal toxicity, traced the probable delivery mechanism to the Gallon Creek, and located visible evidence of mineral runoff at a point upstream of the settlement's water draw." She kept her voice flat and technical, the way she did when she was talking to someone who was assessing her credibility. "I have the evidence I could collect preserved in sealed containers. I need your people to take water samples from multiple points along the creek for proper analysis." He looked at her. He was doing the same thing she was, assessing, filing, deciding. "You have medical training," he said. "Self-trained, apprenticed under my mother, who trained under a physician. 6 years of settlement practice. No formal credential." "None available to me," she said. "If you know of a school that takes women from frontier settlements, I'd be interested to hear about it." Something moved across his face that might have been amusement, arrived at and dismissed quickly. "Tell me about the mine," he said. She told him everything she knew, which was the physical evidence, the historical reference from the messenger boy about the old operation, and the theoretical mechanism for how closed or partially closed mining sites produced ongoing contamination. She told him about the symptoms in precise clinical detail. She told him about the progression she'd observed in the patients she'd treated, and the differential between the original epidemic and the current one, which shared symptom overlap but had different progression patterns in ways that suggested escalating exposure rather than a new pathogen. He listened the way Gideon listened, which was to say, with full attention and no interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, 3 members of the town council hold a financial interest in the mining operation." The room went very still. Even the children in the back were quiet. "That's not closed public knowledge," he continued. "It's in the commercial records. I pulled them before I wrote out because Eleanor was specific about what I'd be walking into." He looked at Liora steadily. They would have known the operation was producing runoff. The site remediation required under the Territorial Mining Ordinance was never completed, I have records of the inspection waivers, signed off by a regional official who has since retired to considerably nicer circumstances than his salary should have allowed. Liora sat with this for a moment. Let it settle. They knew, she said. The council members. They knew the creek was contaminated. Almost certainly, Hale said. Not necessarily the full extent of what it would produce in terms of health consequences. But they knew about the runoff, and they chose not to disclose it or address it. And when children started dying, Liora said slowly, having something else to blame for it would have been very convenient, Hale said. I'm not saying it was coordinated. I'm saying the incentive existed. She looked at the wall for a moment, at the shelf with the jars, the carefully organized supplies. She thought about Harmon Crest standing over her with organized certainty. She thought about Pollard at the doorway with his hat in his hands. She thought about the torch against the barn door and Thomas's cough in the dark, and the moment in the barn when she'd leaned her head back against the wall and decided it was probably over. She thought about Ruth Crest, 7 years old, dead of something that was a crime, not a mystery. Was Crest involved? She asked. In the council arrangement. He's not a named party, Hale said. He may genuinely have not known the economic details. What he knew about the health risk, I don't have a position on that yet. He paused. Grief is a powerful organizer of perception. People see what makes their grief bearable. I know, she said. I'm a healer. I know what grief does to people's judgment. She looked at him. That doesn't mean the harm done on the basis of that grief becomes acceptable. No, Hale said. It doesn't. He left to begin his investigation. She went back to her patients. The days that followed had a strange double quality. The intense focus of the medical work happening alongside the slower, more turbulent process of the investigation moving through the settlement like weather, touching everything and leaving nothing quite in the same configuration it had been. She heard things through the people who came to the cabin, fragments of what was developing in the places she wasn't present to. 2 of the 3 council members had been questioned at length. A 4th man, a factor who managed the mine company's accounts, had apparently tried to leave the settlement the day after Hale arrived and been turned back by Hale's assistants, which produced its own crisis of confrontation that she heard about secondhand. She stayed with the medicine. It was what she could control, and control was a limited resource she was managing carefully. The children improved. Not all at once, and not without setbacks. Maeve had a second episode of throat swelling on the 4th day that required Liora to drop everything and return to her house and spend 2 hours doing work she'd hoped not to have to repeat. And afterward, she sat on the floor outside Maeve's room for 10 minutes alone before she could get herself organized enough to move on. The 9-year-old boy from the first evening, his name was Peter, she'd learned, Peter Dahl, son of a carpenter, recovered fast enough that he was trying to get out of bed and go outside by the 3rd day, which she'd initially resisted and then allowed on a limited basis because the instinct toward normal behavior was itself a recovery signal she didn't want to suppress. Peter's father came to find her on the 4th day. He was a large, quiet man with sawdust in the creases of his hands that no amount of washing seemed to fully address, and he stood in the door of the cabin and turned his hat in his hands the way Pollard had turned his hat in the doorway the night they'd been sent away. But this was different. I was at the meeting, Peter's father said, the one Crest called in December when they decided. He stopped. I voted yes. She looked at him. I want you to know that, he said. I don't want to thank you for what you did for Peter and then let you think I was someone who was just standing by. I was one of the ones who voted for it. She was quiet for a moment. She felt the anger. She'd said it to Gideon, anger she was working on directing, and she let herself feel it and did not perform it. Why? She asked. Harmon Crest is a man people listen to, he said, and 3 children had died, and I was scared, same as everyone, and… He stopped. That's all I've got. It's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's all I've got. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing she hadn't let herself think about too precisely, because thinking about it too precisely made it too large to hold. Not the leaders, not Harmon Crest with his organized certainty and his compromised counsel, but the ordinary people who had voted yes, who had chosen the comfortable target over the uncomfortable question, who had let fear do their thinking and their choosing. Your son is alive, she said finally. Whatever you did, go make it mean something. He looked at her. His jaw worked. He nodded once and left. She closed the cabin door and stood with her back against it for a moment, eyes closed. She heard Gideon in the back room talking quietly to one of the parents, something low and practical. She heard the fire. She heard the wind. Then she straightened and went back to work. It was on the 6th day that Harmon Crest came to the cabin. She'd known he would eventually. She'd known it the same way she'd known Webb would come back to Gideon's with more men, not because she could predict individual decisions, but because the logic of the situation made certain things inevitable. Crest was a man who organized things, as Gideon had said. He didn't let things remain unresolved. One way or another, he would come. He came in the early afternoon when the cabin was temporarily quiet. The morning's critical cases managed, the afternoon visits not yet begun. She was at the table with her mother's journal, finally actually reading it rather than just holding it, going back through entries she'd read dozens of times, and finding things in them she hadn't noticed before. The knock was controlled. 3 knocks, even spacing. The knock of a man who had considered the act of knocking before he did it. She opened the door. He looked smaller than he had in the common area, which she recognized as a perceptual effect. The mob had been behind him there, and size is partly composed of what surrounds a person. Here he was just a man in his 60s in a heavy coat, with a face that had aged measurably since December. "May I come in?" he said. The politeness surprised her. She stepped back and let him in. He came into the main room and looked around it, the organized medical space, the shelves she'd reorganized, the fire at the right temperature for a sick room, the journal on the table. He took it in without commenting. "The doll boy is better," he said. "Peter." "He is." "And the others?" "Improving, all of them." He stood in the center of the room and looked at his hands, and she recognized the gesture because she'd seen it in patients who were trying to find a way to say something they'd never said before. The hands as a focal point, something to look at while the words organized themselves. "Ruth had the same marks at her lips," he said. "At the end, the blue. I thought it was... I didn't know what to think. The physician who came afterward, from the south, he said it was the fever. He didn't know either." He paused. Nobody knew. "It's a presentation that can look like several things," she said, keeping her voice level. "Without understanding the environmental cause, it's reasonable to misidentify it." "That's..." He stopped. "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "I'm not being generous." He looked up at her. "I drove you out into a blizzard." "Yes," she said. "Your husband died." "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. "I can't..." He stopped again. "I don't know what I can say to that. I've been trying to find what I can say to it for 6 days, and I don't have anything that's worth saying." She looked at him. She thought about Thomas in the barn, about the weight of him in her hands, about the silence that followed. She thought about what she was and wasn't willing to offer this man who had organized her destruction out of grief and fear and the need to have something to blame. "My husband was not a perfect man," she said. "He was stubborn and sometimes sullen, and he had a deep reluctance to admit when he was wrong about anything. But he had stood beside me through 6 years of this work and never once asked me to do less of it or be less of who I was. And he walked out into a blizzard at my side because he knew that was what the situation required." She looked at Crest steadily. "He deserved to die in a bed, surrounded by people who loved him, with time to say the things you want to say. Instead, he died in a collapsing barn in the cold because the community he'd been part of decided his wife was a convenient target." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine. It's not fine. It will never be entirely fine." Another pause, longer. "But I'm still here, and your children are still here. And that's what we have to work with now." Crest stood very still. He was not a man who cried. She could see that, the infrastructure of a person who has always managed feeling through action, but something in him was under serious pressure. "What do you need?" he said. "To stay, to keep treating the children, to see this through." "Your public acknowledgement," she said. "Not for me, for the community. People followed you into this because you led them. They need to hear from you that they were led wrong." "I know," he said. He closed his eyes briefly. "I know." "And the mine," she said. "Whatever influence you have with the council members who've been withholding what they knew, use it. Hale needs cooperation, and he's getting obstruction. Use your influence." I don't have as much influence with them as you might think, he said. I didn't know about the financial arrangement. I want you to know that. I believe you, she said. She did. It was actually worse in some ways that he'd been so certain, so organized, so righteous in his persecution, and the people who'd actually committed the crime had been watching from a comfortable distance. I'll do what you're asking, he said. Both things. And more, if you tell me what more looks like. She looked at him for a long moment, at the face of a man who had aged a decade in 6 weeks and was now, late and inadequately, trying to do something with what remained. Come back tomorrow, she said. Bring whoever on the council is willing to cooperate with Hale, and we'll figure out the rest as we go. He left. She stood at the closed door for a moment, and then she went back to the table and sat down with the journal and didn't read it, just sat with the quiet of the room around her. Gideon came through from the back. He'd heard the whole conversation. The cabin wasn't large enough for privacy. He didn't comment on any of it. He went to the fire and put another log on, and then came and sat down across from her. You're going to stay, he said. Not a question. Until it's stable, she said. Until the children are clear and Hale has what he needs and the water situation is addressed. She looked at the journal. Then, I don't know. You could go back to Eleanor's, he said. I could. Or somewhere else. Yes. He was quiet. The fire resettled. The afternoon light was coming through the small window at an angle that meant the day was getting late, and with it the cold coming back. I'm going back to the cabin, he said. My cabin. When this is done, I'm going back. He looked at her. I thought you should know. She looked at him. I know. I'm not... He paused, editing himself. I'm not good at settlements, at people in large numbers, at the organizing of things, the politics. He looked at the wall. I'm good at the things I do out there. I know what I am, and I'm not ashamed of it. No one asked you to be, she said. I know. He looked at her again. I just wanted to say it plainly. That's where I'm going. She understood what was underneath it. She was choosing to understand it clearly rather than reading into it something she wanted that might not be there. Thank you, she said, for saying it plainly. He nodded and got up and went back to the patients, and she sat at the table and thought about what plainly actually meant and what she was going to do with what she knew about herself, which was that she was not done yet with any of this, not with the work or the grief or the question of what she was going to build out of what was left. The formal public accounting happened on the 8th day. Hale organized it with the same compact efficiency with which he did everything. The common area, midday, enough notice given that no one could claim later they hadn't been there. The 2 council members who'd been most directly implicated in the mining arrangement stood in front of the community and confirmed, in response to Hale's questions, what they had known and when. The factor who'd tried to leave the settlement provided a written statement from wherever Hale was keeping him that detailed the financial arrangement and the inspection waiver payments. The settlement listened. Liora stood at the edge of the crowd and watched faces. She was looking not for satisfaction. She'd been careful with herself about not wanting that, but for the specific change that happened when people understood something differently than they had before. The reorganization of a face around new information was something she'd learned to read as a healer, because patients had to understand their illness before they could cooperate with the treatment. She watched Dunmore's crossing understand. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the thing you imagined when you imagined justice. People didn't look enlightened or relieved. They looked like people who'd been carrying a weight they didn't know was the wrong weight, and having it replaced with the correct weight, which was heavier and more complicated and didn't distribute as conveniently across their existing assumptions. They looked like people who had some serious reckoning to do with themselves. Harmon Cress spoke next. He stood in the place he'd stood in December, in front of people who had followed his lead, and he said, with the careful precision of a man who had spent 8 days finding the correct words and had not found any that were fully adequate, that he had been wrong, that his grief for his granddaughter had led him to act in ways that were unjust, that Liora Ashcroft had committed no wrong against this community and had in fact saved lives that should never have been at risk, and that whatever restitution was possible would be made. It was not a great speech. It was halting in places and visibly difficult and not comprehensive in its acknowledgement of the specific harms done. But it was said publicly, in front of the same people it had been done in front of, which was the only shape of accountability that meant anything. Liora watched him say it. She did not feel vindicated. She'd thought she might, had wondered about it in the nights when she couldn't sleep, and the anger had more room to move around. But what she actually felt, standing there in the thin winter light, with the crowd in front of her and Gideon a step behind her, was something more like exhaustion, and something more like determination, and something very small and fragile that might, over time, become something close to peace. Not closure. She'd learned enough about loss to know that closure was a word invented by people who hadn't experienced the real thing. Thomas was still dead. Ruth Crest was still dead. The 3 children from December were still dead. You didn't close those things. You carried them, and eventually you built strong enough to carry them without stumbling as often. After the public accounting, people came to her. Not in a crowd. Individually, in ones and twos, through the afternoon and into the early evening, at the cabin or when she was moving between the settlement's households for her final treatment rounds. Some of them were direct about what they were doing, and some of them found indirect ways to do it, offering things, food, materials, the offer of help with whatever she needed, that were carrying other freight than the surface appeared to indicate. She received all of it without judgment and without false warmth. What she gave back was a version of what she'd given Peter's father, honesty and forward motion, the insistence that regret is only useful if it changes what comes next. Aldous Webb came on the afternoon of the 9th day. He didn't bring dogs this time. He came alone, on foot, and he stood in the doorway of the cabin and didn't ask to come in. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You rode to this cabin 4 hours in winter with dogs and 3 armed men," she said, "while I was sick and recovering." "I know." "You did it because Harmon Crest asked you to." "That doesn't—" "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "Apology received for what it's worth. Now go home to your family and think about what it means to follow someone without asking whether what you're following them into is right." He left. She closed the door. Gideon was at the fire. She came and sat down in the chair across from him without speaking. "You're tired," he said. "Extremely," she said. "How many more days do you need here?" She thought about the patients, Maeve, Peter, the others, the stages of recovery each of them was in. She thought about Hale's timeline and what he still needed from her in terms of documentation and testimony. She thought about the community's water situation, which had been temporarily redirected to an eastern well, but would need a longer-term solution that required advocacy. She was not sure anyone here would pursue adequately without someone keeping pressure on it. "Probably 2 more weeks," she said. "Maybe 3. "And then?" he said. She looked at him across the firelight. She thought about what he'd told her, plainly, as he'd said. Where he was going. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to figure out what I want, which I haven't had time to do yet because I've been trying to keep people alive." "Fair enough," he said. "Is it?" she said. It came out with more weight than she'd intended. He looked at her. Not startled, Gideon didn't startle, but attentive in the particular way he was when something required his full attention. "Is it fair," she said, "that I still don't know what I want? That I've been here for 9 days and I've treated 8 children and confronted the man who tried to kill me and watched a public accounting, and I still don't know what I want to do next or where to go or what I'm building or who with—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm tired and I'm saying things without the filter." "Don't apologize," he said. "I'd rather have the things without the filter." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady, patient attention of a man who had learned, through solitude and loss and the long, slow work of putting himself back together in the wilderness, that some things couldn't be rushed and some things were worth waiting for. And the difference between those 2 categories was the thing you spent a lifetime learning to read. "I know what I don't want," she said. "I don't want to go back to what I had here, even if they offered it, even if everyone in this settlement got down on their knees, and they won't, and they shouldn't, that's not the right shape for it. I don't want this life back. This specific version of it." "What version do you want?" he said. She was quiet for a long time. The fire moved. The cabin held the warmth in the particular way of small structures built for survival, not elegant, but effective, which she had come to think of as one of the better things a thing could be. "One that I build," she said, "that I choose. Not one I inherit from necessity or slide into because there's nothing else available." She looked at the fire. "I have been a healer my whole life because it was what was needed, and I had the knowledge, and I couldn't not do it when people needed it done. That's not going away. I'm not walking away from the work." She paused. "But I want to do it somewhere I choose, with people who earned my trust rather than assumed they were entitled to it." Gideon said nothing for a moment. The fire said what it always said, which was that warmth was its own kind of argument. "There's land near my cabin," he said. "East side. Flat clearing, south-facing, sheltered by the ridge on the north. Reasonable building ground." She looked at him. "I'm not—" He paused. "I was doing what he did when he was choosing his words carefully, which was a different thing from hesitating. I'm not saying what that means. I don't know yet what it means. I'm saying the land is there, and it's good building ground, and you said you wanted to choose." She looked at him for a long moment, at the weathered face, the careful eyes, the broken finger bent at its permanent odd angle, at the man who had walked into a collapsing barn in a blizzard because he'd seen tracks in a field and decided to follow them. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I asked," he said. She turned back to the fire. He turned back to the fire. The cabin held them both in its small warmth, and outside the winter was doing what it did, persistent, indifferent, neither hostile nor kind, just present and demanding and full of the particular possibility that belongs to things that have not yet been decided. She thought about it for 3 weeks. Not continuously, she didn't have the luxury of continuous thought, not with patients still recovering and Hale still needing her testimony, and the settlement's water situation requiring more advocacy than she'd anticipated, but in the spaces between tasks, in the early mornings before the cabin was fully awake, and the late evenings after the last patient check, she turned the question over the way she turned difficult diagnoses over, looking at it from different angles, testing it against what she knew about herself. The land east of Gideon's cabin, south-facing, sheltered by the ridge. She'd seen it once, in passing, during the 2 days they'd traveled north to Eleanor's Valley. A clearing that opened unexpectedly from the tree line, wider than she'd expected, with the particular quality of light that south-facing ground gets in winter. Not warm exactly, but brighter than its surroundings, as if the land itself was making an effort. She hadn't registered it consciously at the time, because she'd been focused on moving, and on the cold, and on not thinking about Thomas. But it had gone in somewhere, filed without her permission, and it came back to her now with more detail than she'd known she'd stored. Maeve was the last patient she discharged from active monitoring. 11 days after Liora had crouched on the floor of that small house, with the child's airway narrowing and her own hands the only available tool, Maeve walked into the cabin on her own feet with her color entirely restored and a gap-toothed expression that communicated more about the resilience of small children than any clinical documentation could. Her mother came behind her, carrying a covered dish that turned out to contain a beef stew that Liora and Gideon ate for 2 meals, and neither of them complained about. "She asked if she could see you," the mother said. "She's been asking for 4 days. I made her wait until you said she was clear." "She's clear," Liora said. Maeve looked at Liora with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. She looked specifically at the left wrist, which happened to be visible because Liora had pushed her sleeves up for the examination. "What's that?" Maeve asked. "A birthmark," Liora said. "I've had it since I was born." "Does it hurt?" "No." "Can I touch it?" Leora's mother would have said the same thing hers had said, that birthmarks are private and children should not touch strangers without asking. But Maeve had asked, which was the relevant thing, and Liora held out her wrist. The girl pressed 2 small fingers against the mark with the serious concentration of a scientist conducting an investigation. And then she looked up. "It's soft," she said, "like regular skin." "Yes," Liora said, "exactly like regular skin." Maeve apparently considered the matter resolved. She wandered over to look at the supply shelves, and her mother caught her before she could touch anything, and they said their goodbyes and left. And Liora stood in the doorway and watched them go down the frozen track, and something she'd been holding at a careful distance for 3 weeks came a little closer. She went back inside. Gideon was at the table, working on the broken binding of one of his tools, and he looked up when she came in. "Well?" he said. "She's good," Liora said. "She'll be fully herself in another week." "I meant the other thing," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her without pressure. The way he always looked at her, the way she'd come to understand was simply how he was. Not a technique or a managed behavior, but just his actual nature, which had been shaped by years of solitude into something quieter and more patient than most people manage to become. "The land," she said. "Yes." She came and sat down across from him. He set down the tool. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. Something closer to the recognition of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing and is now seeing it arrive. "Tell me," he said. "I build it the way I decide to build it. The lodge, the layout, how I run the medicine, and who I take in and how. That's mine." "Obviously," he said. "I'm not obviouslying it," she said. "I'm saying it out loud because I need it said out loud between us before anything else." "Understood," he said. "What else?" "I'm not done grieving Thomas," she said. "I don't know when I will be done. I'm not going to pretend a timeline for it or perform being further along than I am." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "And you—" She paused. "You're not done with Nora either. I know that. 7 years doesn't finish it. I know that better than most people." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't finish it." "So we go slowly," she said. "Whatever this is, it goes slowly. We figure it out as we go." He looked at her. "I was going to suggest the same thing," he said. I don't have a plan for this. I haven't had anything that looked like this in a long time, and I don't want to wreck it by moving faster than it should go." Good, she said. "Then we agree." "We agree," he said. He picked up his tool again. She pulled her mother's journal toward her and opened it. They sat at the table together in the afternoon light, each doing what they were doing, and neither of them felt the need to add anything to what had just been said. That was, she thought, probably the best possible sign. She spent the last few days in Dunmore's Crossing doing the things that needed doing before she could leave it with a clear conscience. She wrote out treatment protocols for the children still in recovery, detailed, specific, with clear instructions for what to watch for and when to seek further help, and where that further help might be found, given that she would no longer be available. She spoke at length with a woman named Birch, who had shown, over the previous 3 weeks, a natural aptitude for the nursing side of the work. Someone who paid attention, who didn't panic, who could follow complex instructions and remember what she'd been told. Liora spent 2 full afternoons teaching Birch. Everything she could teach in 2 full afternoons, which was a small fraction of what she knew, and a significant fraction of what the settlement would need in the next 6 months. "It's not enough," Liora told her honestly on the second afternoon. "I know," Birch said. "Tell me anyway." So she told her anyway, and Birch wrote it down in a notebook she'd obtained specifically for this purpose. And Liora thought about her mother handing a journal to a 17-year-old girl and saying the community needs a healer more than you need a normal life. And she felt the thread of that, the thing that got passed forward, imperfectly and incompletely but persistently, generation to generation, woman to woman, through settlements that always needed more than they had. Hale completed his formal investigation on the 14th day. He came to find her in the cabin on the evening before he left and sat down with the particular posture of a man who has finished one kind of work and is transitioning to another. "The 2 council members will face territorial charges," he said. "The commercial fraud is straightforward. The inspection waivers, the financial arrangement, the concealment of known contamination. The health consequences argument is harder to make under current law, but I'll make it anyway because the law needs to be pushed on this." "And the mine site?" she said. "The company that holds the original charter is technically dissolved, but the principles are traceable. The remediation order will go through the territorial authority, and they'll be required to fund a proper closure." He paused. "It'll take time. The creek won't be clean for months, possibly longer depending on what the site assessment finds. The settlement needs an alternative water source in the meantime," she said. "A permanent one, not just the eastern well. I've noted that in my recommendations. Will anyone act on your recommendations?" He looked at her. "Some of them," he said. "The ones that are easy and don't cost money, quickly. The ones that are harder, slowly, and with pressure." He said it without bitterness, the flat pragmatism of someone who had been working within institutional structures long enough to understand their specific failures without being destroyed by them. "That's honest," she said. "I find honest more useful than optimistic," he said. "In my experience, optimism without honesty just produces disappointment, and people who are disappointed stop trusting the system entirely, which makes everything worse. I've been saying something similar for years, she said. People used to tell me I was too blunt. You are too blunt, he said. It's one of the more effective things about you. He stood up and gathered his coat. For what it's worth, your identification of the contamination was correct in every clinical detail. If you'd had formal credentials, what you did here would be discussed in medical circles for years. She looked at him. But I don't have formal credentials. No, he said. But the children are alive, which is the credential that actually matters. He held out his hand, and she shook it, and that was the end of Marcus Hale's involvement in the story of Dunmore's Crossing. She left 2 days later. She didn't announce it. She said her goodbyes individually to the people she wanted to say goodbye to, starting with Birch and ending with Peter Dahl, who was fully recovered and had apparently decided that Liora was the most interesting adult he'd encountered, and expressed this by showing up at the cabin on her last morning and presenting her with a small carved wooden figure he'd made, rough-hewn and recognizable only because he explained that it was a person holding a bag, which was meant to be her with the medicine satchel. She looked at it for a moment and then put it carefully in the top of the satchel. "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep it." Peter looked satisfied in the way of people who have done something they meant to do. Then he went home, and she finished packing, and Gideon loaded the sled he'd prepared with everything they were taking, which was more than she'd arrived with and less than she might have expected, and they left Dunmore's Crossing in the early morning of the 15th day. She did not look back when they cleared the last building. She'd been tempted to. There was some instinct toward the symbolic gesture, the final look at the place that had shaped this chapter. But she was not a person who performed her own life for an audience, not even herself, so she kept her eyes on the trail north and let the settlement recede behind her without ceremony. The cold was still serious, but had shifted character since December, less brutal, more negotiable, the cold of late winter moving toward something, even if that something was still weeks away. Gideon moved through it with his usual ease, and she moved through it now with her own version of that. Not his, not the ease of a man who had spent 7 years making the wilderness his primary habitat, but something she'd earned over the past weeks. A competence that was partly physical and partly attitudinal. The understanding that the wilderness was not the problem. The wilderness had simply been the location where the real problems became impossible to avoid. They stopped at dusk the first day at the barn. She'd known they would pass it. She'd known for days and had been preparing herself for it without entirely admitting that was what she was doing. When the dark shape of it appeared through the trees, she felt the thing she expected to feel, which was large and without clean edges, and not something she was going to be able to manage tidily. Gideon stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "We don't have to stop," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." She went to the door, frozen again in its track. She had to pull hard, and opened it and went inside. The cold inside was the same as outside, maybe slightly less due to the walls, and the light was the last thin light of the day coming through the gap in the ruined roof. She could see the place against the wall where she'd been sitting. She could see the packed earth floor where Thomas had been. The barn had no particular feeling in it. It was just a structure, just wood and cold air and the smell of old, rotted hay. Thomas was not here. She knew that. She had always known that. Even in the immediate aftermath, some part of her had understood that the thing lying on the barn floor was not Thomas, but rather what Thomas had been made of, which was entirely different from what he had been. What Thomas had been was in her, in every decision she'd made in the weeks since, in the stubbornness that she'd identified as her own, but that had also been his, in the capacity for loyalty that she'd watched in him for years, and had absorbed without knowing she was absorbing it. She stood there for a few minutes. She didn't talk out loud to him because that wasn't something she did, not because she thought it was wrong, but because it wasn't the shape of her grief. Her grief was interior. It lived in the space between decision and action, in the half-second before she did hard things when she thought about the fact that he had always believed she could. She went back outside. Gideon was where she'd left him, not having moved closer or spoken while she was inside. "When the ground breaks," she said, "I want to come back and do it properly." "We'll come back," he said, "and I want a marker, not elaborate, just a marker." "We'll make one," he said, "whatever you want it to say." She nodded. They kept walking. They reached Eleanor's Valley on the second afternoon, stopping for one night on Gideon's suggestion. He wanted Eleanor to know they were all right, And also, she suspected, he wanted her to see that Liora was all right, which was different from being told about it. Eleanor opened the door of the main building before they knocked, which either meant she'd been watching or she simply had the particular spatial awareness of a person who had been managing a community long enough that her instincts functioned like an early warning system. She looked at Liora. She looked at the sled. She looked at the fact that they were arriving together, moving together in the coordinated way of people who have been traveling together long enough to have worked out the small logistics. "You're staying," she said. "No," Liora said. "Just overnight. We're going north." "To his cabin," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "Near it," Liora said. "I'm building." Eleanor held her gaze for a moment, then something in her face, that controlled, evaluating face that revealed very little, shifted just enough to constitute something warmer. "Come inside," she said. "You can tell me what you're building." She did. They sat at Eleanor's long table with the community gathering around for the evening meal, and Liora explained the clearing, the south-facing ground, the plan for a lodge that could function as a healing space and shelter both. Eleanor listened and asked practical questions, materials, structure, what she knew about northern frontier construction, and offered information about where to source what she couldn't find locally and who in the broader territory could be counted on for specific kinds of help. "There's a man named Cassidy who travels the northern circuit," Eleanor said. "Carpenter by trade. He'll work for fair pay and he doesn't ask unnecessary questions, which is the most important qualification." She looked at Liora. "I'll send word to him." "I don't know that I need a carpenter," Liora said. "You need someone who knows how to build in northern conditions," Eleanor said. "What you know how to do is heal people. Don't let pride stop you accepting help in the area where your knowledge has limits." Liora received this without argument, which she thought was progress. Young Cale, the boy with the sprained elbow from 3 weeks back, fully recovered, with the particular energy of 12-year-olds who feel they have an established relationship with you, sat across from her at dinner and informed her with complete seriousness that he intended to come work for her at the lodge when he was old enough. "Do you?" she said. "I want to learn medicine," he said. "Eleanor won't teach me because she says she doesn't know enough, but you know enough." "I have a sprained elbow as evidence of your tendency toward risky behavior," she said. "That's a concerning quality in a medical apprentice." He thought about this. "I could work on it," he said. "You could," she said. "Come find me in 3 years if you're still interested. We'll see where things stand." His expression was that of someone filing a date in a mental calendar they fully intended to consult. She thought he probably would. Eleanor walked them to the edge of the valley the next morning. She stopped at the tree line and looked at them both. Gideon first, then Liora, with the expression of someone taking a reading. "You'll have trouble," she said. "Not immediately, but eventually. The people you treated in Dunmore's Crossing will tell other people about you, and some of those other people will be afraid of what they hear, and some of them will need what you have, and some of them will not be able to tell the difference between needing something and resenting it." She looked at Liora directly. "You know this." "I know this," Liora said. "And you're going anyway." "I'm going anyway." Eleanor nodded once. "Good," she said. "People who know what they're choosing are harder to break than people who stumble into it." She paused. "Send word when you're established. I'll visit in summer if the pass is clear." She turned and went back into the valley without a prolonged goodbye, which was so entirely consistent with who she was that Liora felt a wave of something she recognized as affection, the kind that arrives when a person behaves exactly as themselves in a moment that invites performance. They reached Gideon's cabin on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The cabin looked the same as when they'd left it. He'd left it well sealed, the wood stores covered, the essentials preserved. He went in first and got the fire going while she stood in the clearing in front of it for a moment, getting her bearings, letting the physical reality of the place settle into her body after weeks of holding it as an abstract. The eastern clearing was 20 minutes' walk from where she stood. She knew that. She'd confirmed it on the way in, noting the landmark, registering the distance. She did not go look at it that first evening. She helped unload the sled and get the cabin organized, and she ate the meal Gideon made, sparse, practical, nothing elaborate, the cooking of someone who treated food as fuel rather than experience. And she sat by the fire with her mother's journal, and she felt the particular quality of quiet that belongs to a place at the edge of wilderness, which is different from any other kind of quiet. in the way it is complete rather than partial, not the absence of sound so much as the presence of a silence that has its own texture. "I'm going to look at the clearing tomorrow," she said. "I'll come if you want," Gideon said. "I'll go alone first," she said. "Then we'll go together." He nodded and went back to what he was doing, which was sharpening the axe blade in the slow, methodical way he did things that required precision. Not rushing, not performing patience, but actually being patient, which she had come to think of as one of the rarer qualities in people. She went alone in the morning, as she'd said before he was up. The trail was easy enough, she'd paid attention on the way in, and the clearing opened from the tree line the way she'd remembered, wider than the trees suggested from the outside, catching the early light in a way that made the snow surface look almost warm. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking inventory. The ridge to the north would block the worst of the winter wind. The southern exposure meant real light for a real portion of the day, even in February. The ground beneath the snow, she scraped at it with the heel of her boot, was not rock, not swamp, not the deep sand that gave you problems with foundation. Solid, workable. She stood there for a long time. She thought about what she was doing, and she allowed herself to think about it clearly, without the protective distance she'd been keeping from it for weeks. She was 31 years old. She had been driven into a blizzard with nothing, and she had lost her husband in a collapsing barn, and she had nearly died of cold and starvation, and she had walked back into the community that tried to kill her and save their children, and she was now standing in a clearing in the northern wilderness choosing, with full information and no one asking anything of her, what she was going to build next. The fear was present. She named it honestly. She was afraid of another community that turned. She knew that fear would probably never fully leave her, and she thought that was appropriate, that some fears should stay because they carried real information about real danger. She was afraid of building something and having it taken. She was afraid of the grief that was still unfinished, and what it might do to the work, and to whatever was developing between her and Gideon, which was real and fragile and too new to be certain about. She named all of it. And then she stood in the clearing and looked at the ridge and the light and the solid ground, and she made the decision she'd already made, fully and without reservation. She went back to the cabin. Gideon was outside when she returned, splitting wood with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of someone who has done a task so many times it has become meditative. He stopped when he saw her and looked at her face. "Well," he said. "We need to figure out the foundation," she said. "And I want 3 rooms, not 2, a proper treatment space separate from the living space, and a room where people can stay if they're too sick to travel home. That's non-negotiable." Something opened in his expression. It wasn't a large thing. It was the opening of something that had been hoping without letting itself say so. "I know how to build the foundation," he said. "I've done it before." "Eleanor is sending a carpenter named Cassidy," she said. "I know Cassidy," he said. "He's good." "Then we have a plan," she said. "We have a plan," he said. He picked up the axe and went back to the wood. She went inside and sat down at the table and opened her mother's journal to a blank page at the back. There were several. Her mother had always left pages at the back. She'd never known why exactly, maybe for exactly this. And she began to write. Not a treatment protocol, not a list of supplies or a structural plan. She wrote the beginning of what she was building, in words, for herself. The shape of it, the purpose of it, the principles that would govern how she ran it. Anyone in need, welcomed without judgment. No requirement to justify yourself to receive care. Payment in whatever form was possible, and no payment as an option when nothing was possible, because the inability to pay was not a moral failing, and she would not treat it as one. The work conducted on the basis of what was known rather than what was feared. Every decision made with evidence, not superstition, and the courage to say I don't know when she didn't know, rather than filling the gap with false certainty. She wrote for an hour. When she stopped, she read it back to herself. She made 2 corrections. Then she closed the journal. Cassidy arrived 6 weeks later, in what was technically early spring, though the territory had its own understanding of seasons that didn't align with any calendar. I was a wiry, unsentimental man of perhaps 55 who looked at the clearing with the assessing squint of someone reading a language. He'd been speaking for decades, walked it in 3 directions, asked Liora 4 very specific questions about what she intended to put where, and then told her it was good ground and they could start the following morning. He worked in a way she respected, which was to say, He worked without talking much, made decisions within his domain without needing them approved, and flagged the things she needed to decide about with the minimum of preamble. When he thought she was wrong about something, he said so directly, and then accepted her decision when she made it, even when she went against his recommendation, which happened twice. The second time it happened, he looked at her and said, "You're the one building it," which was meant as a concession and functioned as a compliment. Gideon worked alongside Cassidy with the practical ease of men who know adjacent trades and can function together without establishing hierarchy. They didn't talk much. Men like that rarely did. But the work was coordinated and efficient, and by the end of the third week the foundation was down, and the framing was up, and the shape of the lodge was visible in the clearing. She helped where she could, which was wherever muscle and a willing pair of hands were useful. She was not trained in construction, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise, but she was competent at following instruction and not getting in the way, which Cassidy had told her once was more valuable than most people understood. In the evenings, the three of them ate at Gideon's table and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. Cassidy was a man with a traveled life. He'd worked across the territory for 30 years and knew its contours intimately. The settlements and the roads and the patterns of how communities developed and failed and occasionally managed to sustain themselves. He told stories when the mood was right, compressed stories, the kind that contained maximum information in minimum words, which Liora appreciated. On the fourth week, he told them, without being asked and in the middle of eating, that he'd heard about what happened in Dunmore's Crossing. "Where did you hear it?" Gideon asked. "3 different places," Cassidy said. "The story's moving." He looked at Liora. "They're calling you the healer who came back." She absorbed this. "That's not what I'd call myself," she said. "It rarely matters what you'd call yourself," Cassidy said, and went back to eating. She thought about it that night, alone, which was where she did most of her serious thinking, the story moving, her name traveling through the territory in the way that names traveled, changed, simplified, amplified, stripped of context, carried by people who didn't know her into places she'd never been. She'd never sought that. She was genuinely not sure how she felt about it. But she thought about Birch in Dunmore's Crossing with her notebook, writing down everything Liora could teach her in 2 afternoons. She thought about Kyle, 12 years old, announcing his intention to become a medical apprentice. She thought about the carved wooden figure in her satchel, rough-hewn, recognizable only because its maker had explained it. There were worse things to be known as. There were worse stories for people to carry forward. The lodge was substantially complete by the end of the 6th week, though complete was a relative term. There were details remaining, finish work, the treatment room's shelving and surface that Liora designed herself based on 6 years of understanding what a working medical space actually required, as opposed to what looked reasonable to someone who'd never worked in one. Those things took another 2 weeks, and at the end of that time Cassidy declared himself satisfied, which was not a word she'd heard him use easily, and named his price, which was fair, and she paid it from what she'd been given as partial restitution from the Dunmore's Crossing Council, which was the form of that money she was most comfortable with. Cassidy left on a Tuesday morning, loaded his tools onto his horse, told them both to send word if they needed him for anything, and that he'd be in the territory through autumn. Then he rode south, and the clearing was quiet. She stood in the doorway of the lodge and looked at it. The treatment room, the main room, the sleep room in the back where patients could stay. The shelves she'd built to her own specifications. The fire that was going because she'd learned from Gideon that in northern frontier construction, you kept fires going to cure the wood and test the chimney draws. And this one drew well, the smoke rising straight and clean. It was not beautiful, it was functional, which she had decided some time ago was the higher standard. The walls were level and the roof was sound and the floor was even and the doors hung correctly, and there was room in the treatment space for 2 patients at once if needed, and a place for her to keep her materials organized in the way she needed them organized. Gideon came to stand beside her. "Well?" he said. "It's good," she said. And then, because she believed in saying what was true when it was true and not saving it, "It's exactly what I wanted." He looked at it. She watched his face, which showed satisfaction, quiet, private satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "Cassidy did good work," he said. "You did good work," she said. "Don't do that thing where you redirect it." He looked at her. "What thing?" "The thing where the compliment makes you uncomfortable, so you give it to someone else." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll work on that," he said, in the tone of someone who means it rather than using it as a deflection. The first patient arrived 11 days after the lodge was complete. She came from the east, a woman of about 60 traveling with her adult daughter, who'd heard from a trapper who'd heard from someone in Eleanor's Valley that there was a healer north of the Gallon territory who took in anyone who needed it. The woman had a prolonged joint condition that had gone unaddressed for years, partly because she couldn't travel to the southern physician, and partly because she'd had 3 experiences with frontier healers who'd taken her money and done her minimal good, and she arrived with the specific combination of genuine need and aggressive skepticism that Liora recognized as entirely reasonable given the history. Liora spent 2 hours with her. She examined the joints in question, asked the right questions, listened to the answers, including the ones that contradicted what the woman had said earlier, and gave her an honest assessment, what she could address, what she couldn't, what the long-term trajectory looked like with and without intervention, what would be required in terms of commitment from the patient herself, because medicine was a collaboration and she was not interested in pretending otherwise. The woman looked at her for a long time after this. "You're not trying to sell me something," she said. "No," Liora said. "The last healer I saw told me he could fix it completely if I paid him in advance for 3 months of treatment." "I can't fix it completely," Liora said. "Nobody can. Honestly, given how long it's been developing, I can make it significantly more manageable and slow the progression. That's the realistic version." "I'll take the realistic version," the woman said. She stayed 4 days. Her daughter stayed with her, sleeping in the back room, helping with the regimen Liora designed, asking good questions that Liora answered fully because questions were how people learn to manage their own conditions, and managing your own condition was always the goal. When they left, the woman's gait was noticeably improved. Not fixed, not what she'd had at 40, but better. And she had a written protocol in her daughter's handwriting that covered the next 6 months. At the door, the woman stopped and looked at Liora's wrist. "Is that the mark they drove you out over?" she said. She'd heard enough of the story to know the rough shape of it. "Yes," Liora said. The woman looked at it for a moment. "Fools," she said, with the comprehensive, unimpressed finality of someone who has lived long enough to have seen many varieties of foolishness and has no patience left for any of them. Then she left. Liora stood in the doorway and watched the 2 women make their way east through the trees, and she felt something she was becoming slowly more acquainted with. Satisfaction of the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just settles in the body quietly, in the chest and the shoulders and the back of the hands. The satisfaction of work done that was the right work, in the right way, for the right reasons. She was aware that she wasn't happy in the way that happiness is described by people who haven't lost what she'd lost. She thought she might not be that kind of happy for a long time, possibly ever, and she'd made her peace with the possibility. But she was something else that was real and durable and had her name on it. She was present, she was purposeful, she was in the right place doing the right thing, and none of that had been handed to her or stumbled upon or arranged by circumstances she'd floated passively through. She had chosen it, every part of it, with full information about the cost. That was not nothing. In fact, she had come to believe it was very nearly everything. The spring came the way it comes in northern frontier territory, not gently, not gradually, but in a sudden decisive commitment, as if the season had been making up its mind for months and then made it all at once. The snow began to pull back from the southern exposures first, then more broadly, and with it came the sound of water moving in the creeks and the smell of actual earth for the first time in months, and the particular quality of light that made you realize how much you'd been squinting against the brightness of snow all winter. She and Gideon went back to the barn in early April. On the first day, the trail was clear enough to make it reasonable. He'd made the marker over the winter, a piece of wood from an oak he'd cut, not carved with anything elaborate, just Thomas's name and the year, and beneath it, a word she'd chosen, known. Not beloved or missed or lost, though all of those were true. Known, because she had known him, fully and imperfectly, and for real, and that was what she wanted the marker to say. They found the spot without difficulty. Gideon had marked it exactly as he'd promised, a stake in the ground that had held through the winter. They cleared the area. He dug where she directed, and it was still difficult going even with the thaw because the frost had gone deep and come back partially, and it took 2 hours for what might have been a 40-minute job in better conditions. She said what she wanted to say at the grave. Privately, internally, The way she did everything that was between her and Thomas, inside herself, where it had always been. She put her hand flat on the turned earth for a moment. Then she stood up. Gideon was a few yards away, giving her the distance she needed without being absent. He did that well. She'd noticed it repeatedly, and it continued to be the right instinct at the right time, which she thought was probably not an instinct at all, but rather a choice, a decision made repeatedly and quietly and without asking for credit. She walked over to him and stood beside him, and they both looked at the marker. "He would have liked you," she said. "That's not a small thing. Thomas didn't like most people. He was particular about it. But he had a good instinct for people who did what they said they'd do. You do what you say you'll do." Gideon looked at the marker for a moment. "I don't know that I would have liked him," he said. "I'm a difficult person to know." He sounds like he was also a difficult person to know. "He was," she said. "Two difficult people who like each other," Gideon said. "Probably would have been fine." She thought about that and thought it was probably right. They walked back north through the afternoon, through the smell of thaw and moving water, and the first tentative green that was beginning to assert itself at the bases of the trees, the future making its intentions known. She thought about the year behind her, the epidemic, the accusation, the blizzard, the barn, Eleanor's Valley, the confrontation, the lodge. She thought about all the things she'd lost and all the things she'd found, which was not an accounting that came out even, loss on one side and gain on the other. It was more complicated than that, more tangled, more human. The gains did not replace the losses, and the losses did not negate the gains, and both of them were real, and both of them were hers. She thought about what kind of person she had been at the start of it, genuinely trying to do good, genuinely committed to the work, but also, if she was honest, somewhat certain about her own rightness. She had been the healer, and the community had needed her, and she had done the work, and there had been something in that arrangement that she hadn't examined carefully enough. The assumption that need would translate into respect, that service would protect her from what it could not actually protect her from. She was not certain in that way anymore. She wasn't sure she'd call it a gift exactly. She'd have preferred to learn it some other way. But she was more honest now, about what she could and couldn't do, about the limits of knowledge and the necessity of saying so, about the fact that doing good work did not guarantee good outcomes, and that was a fact of the work rather than a failure of the worker. And she was more careful about who she trusted, which was not the same as being closed. She still trusted. She had to. The work required it. You could not be a healer from behind a wall. But she trusted based on evidence now, based on what she actually saw people do rather than what they said, or what her need led her to hope. That was the other thing the year had taught her, or refined in her. The lesson was always more complicated than taught from nothing. That trust was something you built incrementally, that the people in her life who had earned it had done so through action, through consistency, through doing what they said and saying what they meant, and staying when staying was difficult. Gideon walked beside her. She looked at him, the familiar profile, the weathered face, the broken finger bent at its permanent angle. "What are you thinking about?" he said, because he occasionally asked, not often, but when it seemed like the question would be welcome. "Everything," she said. "The year, what it cost, what I built out of it. Is that a good thing to be thinking about?" "I think so," she said. "I think you have to look at things directly, or they follow you around in the dark." He considered this. "That's probably right," he said. "Most things are better looked at," she said. "Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones." They walked the rest of the way mostly in silence, comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, the afternoon light was going golden in the particular way of early spring evenings when the sun is finally at an angle that feels deliberate rather than incidental, and the lodge was visible through the trees east of the cabin, its smoke rising in a straight line, the fire she'd banked that morning still holding. She stopped at the fork in the trail between the cabin and the lodge. She did this sometimes, chose which direction, cabin or lodge, based on what the day required. Today, she knew what it required. "I'm going to check the fire," she said. "Then come to the cabin." "I'll have food ready," he said. She walked to the lodge and went inside and checked the fire. Still good, needed one more log, she added it, and stood for a moment in the treatment room. The shelves with their organized medicines, the work surface at the right height, the two chairs for when patients needed time to talk, which they always did. The talking bean is much part of the medicine as anything physical. The carved wooden figure from Peter Doll sat on the corner of the shelf. She'd put it there when she'd set up the room. A person holding a bag. Rough-hewn, recognizable only if you knew what you were looking at. She looked at it for a moment. She knew what she was looking at. She put another log on the fire and left the lodge and walked to the cabin, and the light was doing its golden thing on the snow that was still on the north side of the clearing, and the smoke from the cabin chimney was rising to meet the smoke from the lodge chimney, two thin lines converging somewhere above the ridge in the cold spring air. She went inside.